The clock on the dashboard read 5:47 in the morning when the first gray light began to seep through the fogged windows of the Ford Focus, November in Tacoma, Washington. The kind of cold that crept into your bones and stayed there. The kind that made you question every decision that had led you to this moment. Grace Hartley opened her eyes slowly, her neck stiff from sleeping upright in the driver's seat, her breath visible in small white clouds that disappeared almost as soon as they formed. She was 38 years old. She had been a registered nurse for 12 years. She had saved lives in the emergency room, held the hands of dying patients, told families the news that would change them forever. And now she lived in the car parked behind a Walmart in the far corner of the lot, the spot she had learned was safest after 7 months of trial and error. Far from the security cameras, close to the exit, never blocking the delivery trucks that came before dawn. She did not move right away. Instead, she listened. The rumble of a semi-truck pulling into the loading dock, the distant beep of a forklift, the world waking up and going about its business while she sat frozen in a metal box that smelled like stale air and desperation in the faint lingering scent of the fast food they could no longer afford. In the back seat, her daughter Sophie was already awake. Grace could tell by the soft scratching sound of colored pencil on paper, the sound that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat over these past months. Sophie was 9 years old. She had brown hair that tangled no matter how carefully Grace tried to brush it. She had dark eyes that saw too much for a child her age. And she had a notebook filled with drawings of houses that she added to every single morning, as if by drawing them enough times she could somehow make them real. Grace turned slowly, trying not to make the seat creak, and watched her daughter in the rearview mirror. Sophie sat cross-legged in the narrow space, her sleeping bag bunched around her waist, her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm while she drew with the other. The rabbit was missing an ear. It had been missing that ear since Sophie was 3 years old, back when they still lived in an apartment with heat and running water and a refrigerator that actually worked. The drawing taking shape on the page was the same as always. A house with a peaked roof and a chimney, windows with curtains, a door painted red, and 3 figures standing in front, holding hands, a tall one and a medium one and a small one. Grace knew who the third figure was supposed to be. It was the father Sophie barely remembered. The man Grace had fled from 9 years ago with her infant daughter in her arms, running from fists that came out when he drank, which was every night. He did not deserve to be in those drawings. He did not deserve to be remembered at all. But Sophie was 9, and 9-year-olds still believed in the possibility of wholeness, in families that looked like the ones in picture books. Grace did not have the heart to tell her that some things once broken stayed broken forever. She shifted in her seat and Sophie looked up immediately, her expression brightening in that way that made Grace's chest hurt. "Good morning, Mom." "Morning, baby. I drew our new house." Sophie held up the notebook. "This one has a garden, and a den, and a room for me with a window that looks at trees." Grace forced herself to smile. "It is beautiful, sweetheart. You are getting really good at drawing houses." Sophie studied her work with the critical eye of an artist. "I think the chimney is a little crooked, but that is okay. Crooked chimneys have character." They did have character. Grace wondered where Sophie had learned that word, that concept, that idea that imperfection could be a virtue rather than a flaw. Not from her, certainly. Grace had spent the last 2 years feeling nothing but flawed, nothing but imperfect, nothing but a failure of a mother who could not even provide a roof over her daughter's head. She pushed the thought away. There was no room for self-pity in the morning routine. The morning routine was sacred. The morning routine was the only thing keeping them both sane. Grace climbed out of the driver's seat and into the cold morning air, her breath forming clouds that hung for a moment before dissolving into nothing. She opened the back door and began the process that had become as automatic as breathing. First, the sleeping bags, rolled tight and stuffed into the compression sack that lived in the trunk. Every inch of space mattered when your entire life fit into a 16-year-old sedan. Next, the clothes, Sophie's school outfit for the day, pulled from the vacuum-sealed bag that kept them from wrinkling. 3 outfits in rotation. The same 3 outfits for the past 7 months. Grace had become an expert at washing them in gas station bathrooms, at using hair dryers to get them presentable, at making sure Sophie never looked like what she was. Homeless. The word sat in Grace's mind like a stone. She hated that word. She had been a nurse. She had helped people. She had done everything right, or at least she had tried to, and somehow she had still ended up here, splitting granola bars with her 9-year-old daughter in a Walmart parking lot while the rest of the world slept in warm beds. The water bottle they kept in the car overnight had frozen solid. Grace held it between her palms, trying to melt enough for Sophie to wash her face. The cold burned her hands, but she did not stop. She had gotten good at ignoring pain over the past 2 years. Physical pain, emotional pain, the pain of watching her daughter grow up too fast in the back of a car. It all blurred together after a while. Sophie changed quickly, used to the routine, used to the way Grace held up a blanket as a privacy screen, used to pretending this was normal, that this was just how some people lived. She was so good at pretending, too good. Children should not have to be that good at pretending. Breakfast was half a granola bar each. Grace made sure to break it unevenly, made sure Sophie's half was larger, made sure to put her hand over the brakes so Sophie would not notice. She had been doing this for months now, eating less so her daughter could eat more, and Sophie had never caught on. Or maybe she had caught on and was just pretending not to notice, protecting her mother the way Grace tried to protect her. The thought made Grace want to cry. She did not cry. There would be time for crying later, maybe, when Sophie was at school and Grace was alone in the library, pretending to look for jobs she would never get. Coffee came from the West Station 2 blocks away. 69 cents for the smallest cup, so weak it was barely brown. But it was hot, and hot was a luxury they could not always afford. Grace nursed it slowly while Sophie finished getting ready, savoring the warmth spreading through her chest, trying to make it last. The bus stop was 3 blocks away. Grace walked Sophie there every morning, no matter the weather, no matter how tired she was, no matter how much her feet hurt from another night of trying to sleep sitting up. The walk was the one part of the day that felt almost normal. A mother walking her daughter to school? It could have been any mother, any daughter, any morning in any city in America. But the other mothers drove their children to school in warm cars. The other mothers packed lunches in proper lunch boxes. The other mothers did not have to lie about why they could not host play dates, why they could not volunteer for field trips, why their contact information kept changing. Sophie's teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had started asking questions. Grace could see it in the way she looked at Sophie's clothes. The same 3 outfits, rotating endlessly. The way she looked at Sophie's shoes, the soles worn thin from walking. The way she pulled Grace aside after pickup with that careful concern in her eyes. That look that said she was worried, that she might have to call someone, that living in a car was not acceptable care for a child. Grace lived in fear of that phone call, the one that would bring Child Protective Services to their parking lot, the one that might take Sophie away from her, put her in foster care, separate the only 2 people in the world who needed each other to survive. She would die before she let that happen. She would do anything, sacrifice anything, become anything to keep her daughter with her. Sophie was the only thing she had left, the only thing that mattered, the only reason she got up every morning and went through the routine and kept fighting when everything in her wanted to give up. They reached the bus stop with 5 minutes to spare. Other children were already waiting, bundled in winter coats that looked new, clutching lunch boxes decorated with cartoon characters, talking and laughing like children were supposed to do. Sophie stood slightly apart from them. She had learned to do that, to maintain distance, to avoid the questions she could not answer. Where do you live? What does your house look like? Can I come over and play? Grace watched her daughter watching the other children, and something in her chest cracked a little more. Mom. Sophie's voice was quiet, almost a whisper. Yes, baby? Jessica asked if I could come over to her house after school today. Grace felt the words like a physical blow. Oh, sweetie, what did you tell her? Sophie's voice stayed steady. Matter of fact, the voice of a child who had learned to lie to protect her mother's pride. I told her we were moving soon, that our house is all packed up in boxes. I said maybe after we get settled in the new place. Grace knelt down on the cold sidewalk, her threadbare scrubs from her last nursing job straining at the knees, and pulled her daughter into a hug that threatened to break her. Baby, I am so sorry. This is not forever. I am going to fix this. I know, Mom. Sophie hugged her back, small arms fierce and loyal. We have had worse, right? Remember when the car broke down in Portland and we had to sleep in the bus station? They had indeed had worse, though the fact that a 9-year-old could rank their various states of homelessness made Grace want to scream. She held Sophie tighter instead, breathing in the smell of her hair, cheap shampoo and cold air, and something indefinably Sophie. The bus arrived with a hiss of air brakes. Sophie pulled back, shouldered her worn backpack with its broken zipper held together by a safety pin, and looked at Grace with those serious dark eyes. "I love you, Mom. I love you too, baby. So much." Sophie climbed aboard with the other children, found a seat by the window and pressed her palm against the glass. Grace pressed her palm against the outside of the window, their hands separated by only inches but feeling like miles, and watched the bus pull away until it disappeared around the corner. Then she walked back to the Ford Focus, sat in the driver's seat, and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to cry before she had to pull herself together and face another day of trying to claw their way back to some kind of life. The tears came hard and fast, silent sobs that shook her whole body. She cried for Sophie, who deserved so much better than this. She cried for herself, for the life she had lost, for the future that seemed to get darker with every passing day. She cried for her father, who had died 18 months ago and left a hole in her heart that nothing could fill. Her father, Henry Heartland, the only person in her family who had ever truly loved her, truly seen her, truly believed in her. He had been a mechanic his whole life, a man who worked with his hands and spoke with his actions and never had much money, but always had time for his youngest daughter. He had taught Grace to change a tire when she was 12, taught her to check the oil, to listen to an engine, to diagnose problems by sound and smell and instinct. Those skills had kept the Ford Focus running these past months when she could not afford a mechanic. That knowledge was his gift to her, passed down through patient afternoons in the garage, and she thought of him every time she popped the hood. He had also taught her that family was everything, that blood was thicker than water, that you could always count on the people who shared your name. He had been wrong about that, so terribly, devastatingly wrong. Henry Heartland died 18 months ago from lung cancer that moved too fast for treatment to matter. By the time they found it, by the time the doctors spoke those terrible words, he had maybe 8 weeks left. Grace quit her job to take care of him, moved back into his house, the house she had grown up in, and spent every day at his bedside while her siblings made excuses about why they could not visit. Caroline was too busy with her real estate business. Marcus had work obligations he could not escape. Diane had her own health issues to deal with. Kevin was in the middle of a business venture that required his full attention. Grace changed her father's sheets and bathed him and held his hand through the pain and listened to him talk about the past, about her mother who had died when Grace was only 5, about the life he had tried to build for his children. She was there when he took his last breath. She was the one who closed his eyes. The life insurance policy paid out $85,000. Split 5 ways, that was $17,000 each. Enough to help, enough to matter, but not enough to change anyone's life. Except Grace used her share to pay for the funeral, $12,000 for a casket and a plot and a service that her siblings attended but did not help plan. That left her $5,000, which she used to catch up on the bills that had accumulated while she was not working. Then the request started. Caroline called first, 2 days after they buried their father. Her voice was honey and concern, the same voice she used on clients she was trying to convince to buy a house they could not afford. "Grace, honey, I am in a terrible bind. The market has been so slow and I have this balloon payment coming due on the house. I just need $8,000 to get through the month. I will pay you back as soon as the market picks up. You know I am good for it." Grace had savings then. Not much, but some. Money she had been putting away for Sophie's future, for emergencies, for the rainy days her father always told her to prepare for. She said yes because Caroline was her sister, because family helped family, because she still believed what her father had taught her. Marcus called a week later. His voice was tight, stressed, the voice of a man who had dug himself into a hole and could not see a way out. "Gracie, I need your help. I made some bad investments. I am going to lose everything if I cannot cover this margin call. $11,000 would save me. I swear to God, I will pay you back double. You are the only one I can ask." Grace said yes because Marcus was her brother, because the fear in his voice sounded real, because she remembered him teaching her to ride a bike when she was 6 years old. Diane came next, crying on the phone, something about a medical emergency, Something about surgery she needed and insurance that would not cover it. 6,000, Grace. That is all I need. I would not ask if it was not life or death. Please, you are the only one who can help me. Grace said yes because Diane was her baby sister, because she could not bear to hear her cry, because the thought of Diane's suffering when Grace had the power to help was unbearable. Then there was Kevin, the youngest of them all, the one Grace had practically raised after their mother died. He had a business idea, a sure thing, a guaranteed return, just 15,000 to get started. He would triple her money within a year. Grace said yes because Kevin was the closest thing she had to a son, because she remembered him as a little boy following her around the house, because she wanted so badly to believe that her family was good, that they would come through for her the way she had come through for them. $40,000, everything she had, every dollar of savings, every penny she had set aside for emergencies. She gave it all away because she trusted them, because she believed them, because she was stupid enough to think that family meant something. 3 months later, Grace lost her job. The hospital was downsizing, cutting staff, and she was the newest hire in her department. Just bad luck, her supervisor said. Nothing personal. These things happened. She called Caroline to ask about the money. The phone rang and finally went to voicemail. She left a message. No response. She called Marcus. His number had been disconnected. She called Diane. A man answered. Someone she did not recognize said Diane was not available and hung up before Grace could respond. She called Kevin. He answered, but his voice was different now. Cold, distant. I do not have it, Grace. The business did not work out. I told you it was a risk. Kevin, I need that money. I lost my job. Sophie and I have nothing. I cannot give you what I do not have. Maybe try the others. He hung up. When Grace called back, the number had been blocked. She texted, she emailed, she sent messages through Facebook, through LinkedIn, through every platform she could think of. Nothing, silence. As if she had never existed, as if they had never been family, as if $40,000 and a lifetime of love could simply be erased with the press of a button. The eviction notice came 2 months later. Without savings, without a job, without family to fall back on, Grace could not make rent. She sold everything she could sell, pawned everything she could pawn, and when the sheriff came to change the locks, she loaded Sophie into the Ford Focus and drove away from the only home her daughter had ever known. That was 7 months ago. 7 months of parking lots and rest stops in the back seats of a car that was slowly falling apart. 7 months of job applications that went nowhere because employers asked for addresses and she could not give one. 7 months of watching her daughter grow up too fast in the rearview mirror while the world moved on without them. Her siblings never reached out, not once. They had taken everything she had and then erased her from their lives as if she had never mattered at all. Grace finished crying exactly on the schedule. 5 minutes, not a second more. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, checked her reflection in the rearview mirror to make sure she looked presentable, and started the engine. The library did not open for another hour. She drove instead to St. Mary's Women's Shelter on the east side of Tacoma, the same shelter where she had fled 10 years ago, with infant Sophie in her arms, running from an ex-husband whose fists came out when he drank. Sister Agnes still ran the place, 70 years old now, but still sharp, still kind, still doing the work that most people did not have the stomach for. She let Grace use the shelter's address for mail, since a post office box cost money they did not have, and no employer wanted to send correspondence to a Walmart parking lot. The morning was cold enough that Grace's breath plumed white as she walked up the steps, past women she recognized from the rotation of desperation that cycled people through this place. Some had been here when Grace was here a decade ago, still stuck, still fighting, still hoping for something better that seemed to recede further with every passing day. Sister Agnes looked up from the intake desk when Grace entered. The lines around her eyes deepened with her smile, and Grace felt something loosen in her chest. Sister Agnes was one of the few people in the world who looked at her and saw a person instead of a problem. Grace, good morning. There is a letter for you. Came yesterday. Looks official. The envelope was cream-colored, thick paper stock that felt expensive between Grace's fingers. The kind of paper that came from lawyers or banks, the kind that usually meant bad news. Her first thought was that someone was suing her, that somehow she owed money she did not know about, that the universe had found another way to make her life worse. She looked at the return address, Garrison and Associates, Attorneys at Law, Helena, Montana. Montana. She had never been to Montana, did not know anyone in Montana, could not imagine why a law firm in Helena would be sending her anything. She opened it standing right there in the shelter lobby, Sister Agnes pretending to be busy with paperwork, but clearly curious. The letter inside was typed on matching cream stationery, formal and precise. Dear Ms. Hartley, we are writing to inform you that you have been named as the sole beneficiary in the estate of Walter James Hartley, your late great-uncle. Mr. Hartley passed away 6 months ago at the age of 89. His estate has been finalized, and per his explicit instructions, his property located in Jefferson County, Montana is to be transferred to you and your daughter upon completion of all legal requirements. The property consists of a log cabin structure on 43 acres of forested land with mountain access. There are no outstanding debts, liens, or encumbrances of any kind. The property is free and clear. Mr. Hartley also left a fund to cover your travel expenses should you wish to inspect the property before making any decisions regarding its future. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to arrange transfer of the deed and discuss next steps. Sincerely, Robert Garrison, Esquire. Grace read the letter 3 times. Her hands were shaking before the words actually penetrated. There was something else in the envelope. She pulled it out with fingers that felt numb and disconnected from her body. A check. Made out to Grace Hartley. The amount was $1,500. Travel expenses. She stared at it like it might disappear if she looked away. $1,500. More money than she had seen in one place in over a year. Enough for gas. Enough for food. Enough to maybe, possibly, change everything. Walter Hartley. She tried to place the name, dug through memories of family gatherings she had mostly tried to forget, and came up with a vague impression of an older man at her father's funeral. Standing in the back of the church, not speaking to anyone, wearing an old coat that was clean but not new, the kind of coat a man might own for 30 years and still wear because it worked, and why fix what was not broken. She remembered her father mentioning an uncle once or twice. His father's brother, someone who had moved out west decades ago and never came back. A veteran, she thought. Some kind of hermit who lived alone in the mountains. The family had mostly written him off as eccentric, a black sheep who wanted nothing to do with civilization. And now this uncle she had met maybe twice in her entire life had left her property. Land, a cabin in Montana. It could be nothing. A shack with no plumbing, a trailer falling apart in the woods. Some worthless piece of dirt that would cost more to maintain than it was worth. Or it could be a home. Sister Agnes came around the desk, concern and curiosity warring on her weathered face. She read over Grace's shoulder, her hand coming to rest on Grace's arm with the gentle pressure of someone who had spent decades comforting women in crisis. Grace, child, is everything all right? My great-uncle died. Grace's voice sounded strange in her own ears, distant, like someone else was speaking. He left me property, a cabin in Montana. I do not even remember him. Sister Agnes took the letter from Grace's trembling hands and read it carefully, her lips moving slightly with the words. When she finished, she looked up with something shining in her eyes that Grace recognized as hope. This is from God, child. This is your chance. Grace wanted to believe that, wanted to let hope in after so many months of crushing it down, of protecting herself from disappointment, of knowing that every time she let herself believe things might get better, they only got worse. It could be nothing. The words came out harsh, defensive. A shack with no roof, a pile of debris in the middle of nowhere. Or it could be a home, Sister Agnes squeezed her arm. You will not know unless you go. The thought formed slowly, taking shape against all her instincts toward caution and self-protection. Montana, 43 acres, a cabin. Maybe falling apart, maybe worthless, but maybe just maybe a place where Sophie could have her own room, where they would not wake up to parking lot security knocking on the window, where Grace could stop lying about why they could not have friends over. The check in her hand represented more money than she had had at one time in the 2 years. Enough for gas, enough to get there, enough to maybe get back if it turned out to be nothing. She called the number on the letterhead from Sister Agnes's office phone, her voice steadying as she explained who she was. Yes, she had received the letter. Yes, she wanted to accept the inheritance. The attorney, Robert Garrison, had a kind voice roughened by age. He told her that Walter had been very specific. The property was to go to Grace Hartley and her daughter Sophie. No one else. That everything was in order. That she just needed to come sign the papers and the cabin would be hers. No mortgage, no property taxes for 50 years. Walter had prepaid them through some kind of trust. Free and clear. Grace hung up the phone and looked at Sister Agnes, and for the first time in months, maybe years, allowed herself to feel something that might have been hope. I think we are moving to Montana. The hope lasted exactly 47 minutes. Grace should not have called her sister. She knew that now, could see it clearly in hindsight, but at the time she was still operating under the delusion that family meant something. That blood counted for more than it had proven to. That news like this deserved to be shared. That Caroline would be happy for her. That maybe this windfall could be the beginning of healing the rifts that had torn them apart. She was a fool. She had always been a fool when it came to her family. She called from the payphone outside the library. Sophie still at school. The Ford parked in the shade where it would not get too hot inside. Her heart was racing as she dialed. Hope and fear tangled together in her chest like fighting animals. Caroline answered on the fifth ring, her voice already impatient, already annoyed. The voice of a successful real estate agent who had better things to do than talk to her homeless sister. Grace, what is it? I am showing a house in 20 minutes. Grace took a breath, tried to keep her voice neutral, tried not to sound like she was asking for anything because she was not asking. She was only sharing, only telling her sister news that might matter. Dad's uncle Walter died. He left me property in Montana, a cabin and land. The silence stretched long enough that Grace thought the connection had dropped. She could hear Caroline breathing on the other end, could almost see her sister's perfectly manicured fingers tightening on her phone, could practically feel the calculation happening in real time. Then Caroline laughed, sharp and cutting, the laugh of a woman who had spent her whole life measuring herself against others and always coming up short. A cabin in Montana. Grace, that is pathetic. You cannot handle a studio apartment. You are going to manage property? Just sign it over to me. I will handle the sale. We can split the money. The casual assumption that Grace could not manage her own affairs sparked something hot and angry in her chest. Something that had been building for months, for years, for a lifetime of being the one who gave while others took. It is not yours to handle. Walter left it to me and Sophie specifically. Oh, for God's sake. Caroline's voice went cold, the warmth she used with real estate clients evaporating like mist in sunlight. You are living in your car, Grace. You are not exactly making great decisions. Someone needs to step in before you screw this up too. There was noise in his background. Other voices. Grace realized with a sick feeling that she was on speakerphone, that her other siblings were there, that this call she had thought was private was actually being broadcast to an audience. Marcus's voice came through next, muffled at first like Caroline had her hand over the phone, then more clearly as she switched to speaker. Is that Grace? What does she want now? She inherited some shack in Montana from Dad's weird uncle. Caroline's tone made it clear what she thought of that possibility. Thinks she is going to manage it herself. Marcus laughed, harsher than Caroline's laugh, meaner. Let me guess, you want money to get there? Another loan you will not pay back? The words hit like a slap. Grace's hand tightened on the phone receiver until her knuckles went white. I do not want anything from you. I just thought you should know. How thoughtful. Diane's voice now, the youngest sister, the one who had borrowed $6,000 for a medical emergency that turned out to be a nose job. Honestly, Grace, after everything we have done for you, everything you have done for me, Grace's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. You took Dad's insurance money, all of you, said you would pay me back and then disappeared. Those were loans. Those were loans. Marcus's voice turned sharp, defensive. Not our fault you cannot manage money. You got the same amount we did and somehow you ended up homeless. That is on you. Grace opened her mouth to respond, to point out that she had given them her share on top of their own, that she had believed them when they said family helped family, that they had stolen everything she had and then blamed her for having nothing left. But a small voice interrupted, high and clear through the phone speaker, a voice that made Grace's blood freeze in her veins. You are mean. All of you are mean. Grace's heart stopped. Sophie. She spun around and there was her daughter, standing 3 feet away in her school clothes, backpack slipping off one shoulder, tears streaming down her face. School let out early on Wednesdays. Grace had forgotten. She was supposed to meet Sophie at the library, and Sophie must have walked here looking for her, must have heard everything. Well, if it isn't the little tattletale. Caroline's voice dripped false sweetness through the phone. Grace, you raised a brat. Sophie's voice shook, but it did not break. She stepped closer to the phone, closer to her mother, and spoke with a fierceness that seemed too big for her small body. You took Grandpa's money. You promised to pay Mom back, and you did not. And now you want to take our cabin too? The silence that followed was brittle and sharp. Grace could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could feel her daughter trembling beside her, could sense the moment hanging in the air like a held breath. Then Caroline spoke, voice filled with contempt, with disgust, with the absolute certainty of someone who had never doubted her own righteousness. Grace, get control of your daughter and sign over the property. You are not equipped to handle this. Grace hung up the phone. Her hand was shaking so badly she almost dropped the receiver. She turned to find Sophie standing right there, 9 years old, tears streaming down her face, but her jaw set with determination. She looked so much like Grace's father in that moment, the same stubborn refusal to back down from what was right, that something cracked open in Grace's chest. She knelt down on the sidewalk outside the Tacoma Public Library and took her daughter's face in her hands. Sophie's cheeks were wet and cold, her eyes red-rimmed but blazing. I am sorry, baby. You should not have heard that. They are trying to take our cabin. Sophie's voice was steady now, matter of fact. The cabin great-uncle Walter left us. Are you going to let them? Grace looked at her daughter, 9 years old, sleeping in cars, lying to friends about why she could never have them over, wearing the same 3 outfits for months, watching her mother cry every morning and pretending not to notice. And still fighting, still fierce, still refusing to give up. No, Grace's voice came out stronger than she expected. I am not going to let them. That cabin is ours. Walter wanted us to have it, and we are going to drive to Montana and see it and make it our home. Sophie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Even if it is not very livable, even if it needs work, we can fix things, you know that. We are good at fixing things. Sophie nodded, her small face solemn. I know, Mom, you fix everything. Grace pulled her into a hug right there on the sidewalk. This brave, loyal, impossibly strong little girl who had never had a real childhood, who had learned to lie about having a home and rank their various experiences of homelessness and defend her mother against adults who should have been protecting them both. You and me against the world, baby. You and me against the world. That night in the Ford Focus, neither of them could sleep. Grace lay in the driver's seat, staring at the ceiling, running numbers in her head for the 100th time. $1,500 for travel, minus gas. The Ford got decent mileage, but it was nearly 1,000 miles to Helena. 3 days of driving, maybe 4 if they were careful. Minus food, minus whatever they would need when they got there. It would be tight. It would be terrifying. But staying here, sending out resumes that went nowhere, watching Sophie get thinner and quieter, waiting for Child Protective Services to knock on their window and take away the only person who mattered to her. That was its own kind of terrifying. In the back seat, Sophie had her notebook open to a fresh page. She was drawing by the orange glow of the parking lot lights, creating their future stroke by careful stroke. The title at the top, in her careful 9-year-old printing, read The Journey to Our New Home. Below that, she had drawn the Ford Focus with 2 stick figures visible through the windows. Mountains rose in the distance, taller than any building, topped with snow, even though Sophie had never seen snow on a mountain in her life. The sky was full of stars, more stars than you could ever see in Tacoma, more stars than Sophie probably knew existed. Grace watched her daughter draw in the rearview mirror and felt tears prick her eyes again. This child's unshakable faith that things were about to get better, that they were heading towards something good instead of just running away from something bad. Mom? Yes, baby? Do you think there will be bears? Grace smiled despite everything. Maybe. Montana is pretty wild. What about wolves? Probably those too. Sophie's eyes went wide in the mirror, delighted rather than scared. That is so cool. We are going to live somewhere with actual wild animals, not just pigeons and rats. We do not know what we are going to find there, baby. Grace tried to keep her voice gentle, tried not to crush this fragile hope that had bloomed in her daughter's chest. It might be really rough. I do not care. Sophie went back to her drawing, adding a sun rising over the mountains, rays of light streaming down like promises. Anything is better than the parking lot. Grace could not argue with that. She reached into the glove compartment and pulled out the letter from Robert Garrison. Read it again in the dim light. Let the words wash over her like a prayer. Sole beneficiary, 43 acres, free and clear. Walter Hartley. This ghost of an uncle she barely remembered. This man who had looked at her family and chosen her. Specifically her. Not Caroline with her real estate license. Not Marcus with his business degrees. Not Diane with her dramatic crises. Not Kevin with his sure-thing investments. Her. Grace. The failure. The homeless one. The woman living in her car with a 9-year-old daughter and nothing else to show for 38 years on Earth. Why? She did not have an answer. Maybe she never would. Maybe Walter had been crazy or confused or simply random in his choice. Maybe this would turn out to be another disappointment in a long line of disappointments. But maybe not. Maybe for once in her life, the universe had decided to give instead of take. Grace folded the letter carefully and put it back in the glove compartment. Then she turned around in her seat to look at Sophie directly. We leave tomorrow morning. First thing. Sophie looked up from her drawing. Her eyes were bright, hopeful, full of the kind of belief that Grace had lost somewhere along the way and desperately wanted to find again. Really? Really? We are going to drive to Montana, and we are going to see this cabin, and we are going to figure out what comes next. Together. Sophie scrambled forward, threw her arms around Grace's neck from the back seat, and held on tight. I knew it, she whispered into Grace's shoulder. I knew something good was going to happen. I have been wishing for it every night, Mom, every single night. Grace held her daughter and let herself believe, just for this moment, that wishes could come true, that the universe was not entirely indifferent, that somewhere in Montana, in a cabin built by a man she barely knew, there was a future waiting for them. They would leave at dawn. They would drive east toward the mountains, toward Montana, toward whatever Walter Hartley had left them. And Grace would not look back. Not at the parking lot, not at the family that had abandoned her, not at the life that had crumbled around her through no fault of her own. Only forward, only toward the light breaking over those distant peaks, she and Sophie against the world. It had always been enough before. It would have to be enough now. They left Tacoma at dawn on a Thursday morning in November, the sky still dark, the streets still empty, the world not yet awake to witness their departure. Grace had filled the tank the night before, had checked the oil and the tire pressure and the coolant levels, had done everything her father taught her to do before a long drive. The Ford Focus was old and tired, but it was reliable. It had carried them through 7 months of parking lots and rest stops. It would carry them 950 miles more. Sophie sat in the back seat with her notebook and her stuffed rabbit and a paper map she had bought at the gas station for $2.79. She had never used a paper map before. Everything in her short life had been digital, had been screens and GPS and voices telling you where to turn. But Grace wanted her to learn the old way, wanted her to understand distances and directions and the shape of the country they were crossing. They drove east on Interstate 90 as the sun rose behind them, painting the rearview mirror in shades of gold and pink. Grace watched the city fall away in that mirror, watched Tacoma shrink and disappear, watched the life they were leaving behind become smaller and smaller until it was nothing at all. She did not feel sad. She had expected to feel sad, had braced herself for grief over the loss of familiar streets and known landmarks. But there was nothing to grieve. Tacoma had given her nothing but pain. The only thing she was leaving behind was 7 months of humiliation, and that was not worth mourning. Sophie navigated with the seriousness of a ship's captain, tracing their route with her finger, calculating distances, announcing landmarks before they appeared. We are coming up on Ellensburg, Mom. That is 107 miles from Tacoma. We have 843 miles left. You're doing great, baby. Grace smiled at her daughter in the rearview mirror. How long until we hit the Idaho border? Sophie consulted the map, her brow furrowed in concentration. Looks like about 200 miles, maybe 3 hours if we do not stop. They stopped anyway. For bathroom breaks at rest areas, for cheap gas at stations where Grace paid cash and counted every dollar twice, for peanut butter sandwiches eaten at picnic tables overlooking landscapes that grew wilder with every mile. The country changed as they drove. The urban sprawl of the Puget Sound gave way to farmland, flat and brown in the November chill. The farmland gave way to hills, and the hills gave way to the beginnings of mountains. Real mountains. Not the gentle slopes of the Cascades, but something bigger and older and more imposing. Sophie pressed her face to the window and watched it all with wide eyes. She had never been outside of Tacoma before. Not really. A few trips to Seattle when she was small, a birthday party in Olympia once, but nothing like this. Nothing that stretched to the horizon in every direction and made her feel small in a way that was not frightening, but wonderful. Mom, look! She pointed at a hawk circling above a field. What kind of bird is that? Red-tailed hawk, I think. Grace glanced at where Sophie was pointing. Your grandfather would have known for sure. He was good with birds. I wish I had met him more. Sophie's voice was quiet. Before he got sick, I mean. When he was still himself. Grace felt her throat tighten. Her father had loved Sophie with a fierceness that surprised everyone who knew him. He had been a quiet man, reserved, not given to displays of emotion. But with Sophie, he had been different, softer, more open. He had called her his miracle, his second chance, his proof that good things could still happen in a world that seemed determined to prove otherwise. He loved you so much, baby. More than anything. He used to say you were the best thing that ever happened to this family. Sophie was quiet for a long moment, watching the hawk until it disappeared behind a ridge. Do you think he knows? About us, I mean, about everything that happened. Grace did not believe in heaven. Not really. Did not believe in spirits watching over the living or messages from beyond the grave. But in that moment, driving through country her father had never seen, toward a future he had never imagined, she found herself hoping that he knew. Hoping that somewhere, somehow, Henry Heartland was aware that his youngest daughter and his only grandchild were finally heading towards something good. I think he knows. Grace's voice was steady despite the tears threatening to form. I think he is proud of us. They crossed into Idaho as the sun began to set, the sky turning purple and orange over mountains that rose like walls on either side of the highway. Grace pulled into a rest stop with bathrooms and picnic tables and a view of peaks she could not name, and they ate their peanut butter sandwiches while the last light faded from the sky. Sophie pulled out her notebook and started a new drawing. This one showed the Ford Focus from above, a tiny blue rectangle on a long gray line that wound through green and brown shapes representing the landscape they had crossed. She labeled everything carefully. Tacoma, Ellensburg, the Columbia River, the Idaho border, the rest stop where they were now. We went 312 miles today, Mom, Sophie reported as she drew. Tomorrow we have to go about 400 more to get into Montana. Then it is only about 2 hours from the border to Helena, where Mr. Garrison's office is. You are a good navigator, kid. Grace watched the last light fade from the sky, stars beginning to emerge in numbers she had never seen in the city, more stars than she knew existed, more stars than Sophie probably believed were real. Your grandfather would be proud. Sophie looked up from her map. Do you think he knew? About Uncle Walter, I mean. About the cabin. Grace considered the question. Her father had mentioned his uncle, occasionally. Brief references to a brother who had gone to war and never really come back. A man who had chosen solitude over society, wilderness over civilization. Henry had seemed to understand that choice in a way the rest of the family did not. Had seemed to respect it, even if he did not share it. I think they talked sometimes, not often, but sometimes. They were both veterans. Your grandfather was in Korea, Walter was in Vietnam. Maybe that gave them something in common. Sophie nodded slowly, processing this information. I think Grandpa told Uncle Walter about us, about how we are good people. That is why he left us the cabin. Grace felt tears prick her eyes again. How many times had she cried in the past 2 days? More than in the previous 2 years combined. But these tears were different. Not grief or despair or exhaustion. Something closer to hope. Something that felt almost like healing. Maybe you are right, baby. Maybe that is exactly what happened. They slept in the car that night, parked at the rest stop with semi-trucks idling nearby, and the hum of the interstate never quite fading. Grace woke 3 times from dreams where the cabin turned out to be a burned shell, where Robert Garrison told her there had been a mistake, where her siblings showed up with legal papers proving the property was theirs. Each time she woke, she checked the glove compartment to make sure the letter was still there. Solid proof against her anxiety, tangible evidence that this was real. The second day took them through the rest of Idaho and into Montana, and even Grace, who had braced herself for disappointment, felt something shift when they crossed the state line. There was a sign, blue and gold, the colors of Montana, "Welcome to Big Sky Country." Sophie made Grace stop so she could take a picture with her phone, standing in front of the sign with her arms spread wide like she was trying to embrace the entire state. Her smile was so bright, so unguarded, so full of hope that Grace had to look away for a moment to compose herself. They drove on, and the landscape revealed itself in stages. First, the rolling hills of western Montana, brown and gold under the November sun. Then the mountains closer now, towering over the highway like guardians or sentinels or something even more ancient. Then the forests, pine and fir and aspen, stretching away in every direction until they merged with the sky. "Mom, look!" Sophie's voice was barely above a whisper. "That mountain has snow on the top." "Those are the Rockies, baby. Some of them stay snowy all year round. Can we see them from our cabin?" "I do not know, maybe." Grace did not want to promise anything, could not bear the thought of disappointing her daughter again. But she let herself imagine it, just for a moment, waking up to mountains outside the window, air that smelled like pine instead of exhaust, Sophie running through actual woods instead of concrete parking lots. They reached Helena in the late afternoon of the third day. 3 days that had drained most of the $1,500 but had also been oddly peaceful. Just the two of them, and the road, and the slowly changing landscape. No parking lot security, no pitying looks from strangers, no reminders of everything they had lost. Helena was bigger than Grace had expected. An actual city nestled in a valley with mountains on all sides. Buildings that looked like they had been there since the gold rush days mixed with modern construction. A state capitol with a copper dome that gleamed in the afternoon light. Traffic and pedestrians and all the signs of civilization she had almost forgotten existed. Robert Garrison's office was on a side street downtown, a brick building with his name on a brass plaque by the door. Garrison and Associates, established 1972. The building looked old but well-maintained, the kind of place that valued tradition and permanence over flash and modernity. Grace parked the Ford Focus at a meter, fed it quarters she could barely spare, and stood on the sidewalk looking up at the building. Her heart was racing. Her palms were sweating. Everything they had driven 950 miles for came down to what happened in the next few hours. Sophie took her hand. Her small fingers were warm and steady, a grounding presence that Grace clung to like a lifeline. "Ready, Mom?" "Ready as I will ever be." They climbed in the stairs to the second floor together, their footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell. The office was at the end of the hall, a door with frosted glass and gold lettering, a secretary's desk visible through the window, and beyond it, bookshelves and filing cabinets and all the trappings of a law practice that had been operating for over 50 years. The secretary looked up when they entered. She was in her 60s, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, the kind of woman who had seen everything and could no longer be surprised. Her expression softened when she saw Sophie, when she took in the worn clothes and the tired faces and the obvious desperation barely hidden beneath the surface. "You must be Ms. Hartley." Her voice was warm. "Mr. Garrison is expecting you." Robert Garrison was 72 years old, with silver hair and a weathered face that suggested he spent more time outdoors than behind a desk. He rose when they entered, came around the desk to shake Grace's hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong, then knelt down to Sophie's level and offered his hand to her as well. "You must be Sophie." He treated her like she mattered, like she was part of this, like she was not just a child being dragged along on adult business. "I have heard a lot about you." Sophie shook his hand solemnly. "From who?" "From your great-uncle Walter. He mentioned you in his letters, said he hoped to meet you someday, though he knew that was unlikely." Grace felt something tighten in her chest. Walter had mentioned Sophie, had written about her, had known she existed and thought about her from his cabin in the mountains, hundreds of miles away. "It is very good to meet you both." Garrison straightened up, gestured to the chairs in front of his desk. "Please sit, we have a lot to discuss." The story he told them took nearly an hour. Walter James Hartley was born in 1948 in Spokane, Washington. The younger of two brothers, quiet and studious, good with numbers and books, but not so good with people. He enlisted in the Army in 1960 right out of high school because that was what young men did in those days, and because he wanted to prove himself to a father who had never quite seen him. He went to Vietnam in 1967, served 2 tours, came back in 1970 with a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star, and a mind that would never be quite the same. Garrison paused, his eyes distant, remembering conversations he had had with Walter over the decades. He tried to go back to normal life. Got a job as an accountant in Seattle. He was good at it, had a gift for numbers, for seeing patterns, for understanding how money moved and grew. But he could not handle the crowds, the noise, the way a car backfiring could send him diving for cover, the nightmares that came every single night. PTSD, Grace said the words quietly. They did not have a name for it back then, but that is what it was. Garrison nodded. That is exactly what it was. And there was no help for it, no treatment, no understanding, just people telling him to get over it, to move on, to be a man. So he did the only thing he could think of. He disappeared. He bought the land in 1973, 43 acres in Jefferson County at the end of a Forest Service road, miles from the nearest neighbor. He paid $4,200 for it, everything he had saved from his time in the Army and his years as an accountant. Then he spent 2 summers living in a tent while he built the cabin with his own hands. Every log, Garrison's voice was filled with admiration. Every stone, he cut the trees himself, shaped them himself, fitted them together himself. The foundation, the walls, the roof, the chimney, everything you will see, he built alone. Why did he do it? Sophie's voice was small but curious. Why did he want to be alone? Garrison looked at her for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. Some people, after they have seen certain things, cannot be around other people anymore. Not because they do not like people, but because the world feels too loud, too fast, too overwhelming. Walter needed quiet, needed space, needed to feel the earth under his feet and the sky over his head and nothing else. He lived there for 37 years. Grace tried to wrap her mind around that number. 37 years alone in the woods. Alone, yes, but not idle. Garrison leaned forward in his chair. This is the part you need to understand, Miss Hartley. Walter was not just a hermit living off the land. He was building something, planning something, for decades. He pulled a folder from his desk drawer and opened it. Inside were photocopies of newspaper clippings, financial statements, letters with impressive letterheads. Walter kept a subscription to the Wall Street Journal, had it delivered to the post office in Cedar Falls every week. He studied the markets the way other men study sports or weather. And he invested, carefully, patiently, over decades. He started small, a few $100s here and there. Art he found at estate sales and antique shops. Books he recognized as valuable when others did not. And stocks, companies that seemed risky at the time, but that Walter saw something in. Apple in 1980, Microsoft in 1986, Amazon in 1997. Grace stared at the documents spread across the desk. The numbers did not make sense, could not possibly be real. He never sold. Garrison's voice was almost reverent, never panicked, never second-guessed himself. He just bought and held and waited for 37 years. But how did he know? How could anyone know? I asked him that once. Garrison smiled slightly. He said war taught him patience, taught him to watch and wait and strike only when the moment was right. He said most people lost money because they could not sit still, could not resist the urge to act, could not accept that sometimes the best move was no move at all. Sophie had been listening intently, her notebook open on her lap, though she was not drawing. When did he die? 6 months ago. Garrison's smile faded. Cancer. He knew it was coming for almost a year. Refused treatment because he said he had lived long enough and did not want to spend his last months in hospitals. I visited him once a month at the end. He was at peace with it, said he had done what he came to do. And he left everything to us. Grace's voice was barely a whisper. Why? I only met him twice. Garrison was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Walter watched your family from a distance, attended gatherings when he could stand to be around people. Funerals mostly. He saw you at your father's funeral, saw how you were the only one who cared for him at the end. And he told me something I will never forget. He looked at Grace with eyes that had seen 50 years of clients, 50 years of families tearing each other apart over money and property and wounded pride. He said you were the only one who gave without keeping score, that your siblings took and took and took, but you gave, and he said that kind of person deserved to be protected from the takers of the world. Grace felt tears streaming down her face, did not try to stop them, did not pretend she was not breaking apart inside from the weight of being seen, truly seen, by a man she had barely known. The property is ready for transfer. Garrison pulled another stack of papers from the folder. All the paperwork is in order. I just need your signature in a few places, and then I will drive you out there myself. It is about an hour and a half on decent roads, then another 30 minutes on Forest Service roads that are less decent. What is it like? Grace's voice came out smaller than she intended. The cabin. Garrison considered the question carefully. It is remote, very remote. No power lines running out there, though Walter installed solar panels about 10 years back. Hand pump for water from a well. Wood stove for heat and cooking. It is rustic. It is not going to be easy, but it is solid. Walter built it to last, and he maintained it right up until he died. He looked at Grace with something like hope in his eyes. It is more than a shack, Miss Hartley, if that is what you were worried about. Grace signed the papers where Garrison indicated. Her hand was shaking, making her signature look jagged and uncertain. Sophie watched with wide eyes, understanding in her 9-year-old way that something important was happening, that their lives were changing with every stroke of the pen. When it was done, when the deed had been transferred and notarized and filed, Garrison pulled a brass key from his desk drawer. It was old and worn smooth by decades of use, heavy in a way modern keys were not. He handed it to Grace with a solemnity that felt almost ceremonial. Welcome home, Ms. Hartley. They left the Ford Focus in Helena at Garrison's suggestion. The Forest Service roads were not kind to low-clearance vehicles, and he had a truck that could handle the terrain. It was a battered Chevy from 1987 that had clearly seen better decades but still ran strong. The kind of truck that Grace's father would have appreciated for its reliability and its refusal to quit. Sophie sat between them on the bench seat, bouncing with barely contained excitement, asking questions faster than Garrison could answer them. Did Uncle Walter have any pets? No, he lived alone. Were there really bears? Yes, black bears mostly, but they generally stayed away from people. Could she learn to ride a horse? Well, they did not have a horse, but maybe someday. The drive out of Helena took them through increasingly wild country. Paved roads gave way to gravel. Gravel gave way to dirt tracks barely wider than the truck. The forest closed in on both sides, pine and fir and aspen, the late afternoon sun slanting through the branches in golden bars that made the whole world look like something from a painting. Garrison drove with the easy confidence of someone who had made this trip many times. And he told them more stories about Walter, filling in the outline of a man Grace had never really known. He was a veteran like your father. Garrison's eyes stayed on the road, but his voice was thoughtful. They served in different wars, but that created a bond between them. They wrote letters sometimes. Not often, but when they did, they were honest with each other in ways they could not be with anyone else. My father never mentioned that. Grace tried to reconcile this with her memories of her father, this idea that he had a relationship she had known nothing about. Your father was a private man. Garrison smiled slightly. So was Walter. They understood each other, and they both loved you. Sophie perked up at this. Uncle Walter loved my mom very much. He watched her from a distance for years. Saw how she took care of your grandfather when he was sick. Saw how she raised you alone with dignity and strength. He respected her more than almost anyone else in your family. The truck rounded a final curve and the forest opened into a clearing. And there it was. The cabin. Grace heard Sophie gasp beside her, a small sound of pure wonder that she would remember for the rest of her life. It was not a shack. It was not a pile of debris. It was not the disappointment she had been bracing herself for since the moment she read Garrison's letter. It was beautiful. 2 stories of hand-hewn logs, darkened by weather and time to a deep honey color that seemed to glow in the late afternoon light. A steep metal roof gone green with age, but clearly still sound, not a single patch of rust visible anywhere. A stone chimney rising from the center, built from granite that must have been hauled from the mountains themselves, fitted together with barely visible mortar that spoke of skill and patience and love. A wide porch wrapped around the front of the cabin, the railings carved with intricate patterns of leaves and birds and vines. Windows with real glass panes, dozens of them, reflecting the mountains that rose behind the cabin like a painted backdrop, purple and white with snow, impossibly beautiful, impossibly real. And the land, 43 acres of forest and meadow and mountain, stretching away in every direction, untouched and pristine and belonging to them. To Grace and Sophie, a homeless mother and her 9-year-old daughter who had been sleeping in a car 3 days ago. Sophie scrambled out of the truck before it had fully stopped. She stood in the clearing, turning slowly, trying to take in everything at once. The cabin, the mountains, the forest, the sky that seemed bigger here than anywhere she had ever been. Mom, her voice was barely audible. Mom, it is real. Grace got out of the truck on legs that felt like they might give way. She stood next to her daughter and looked at what Walter Hartley had built with his own hands over 2 summers, 50 years ago. Looked at the home he had maintained and protected and loved for 37 years of solitude. Looked at the gift he had left for a niece he barely knew because he saw something in her worth protecting. She thought about the parking lot behind Walmart, the pitying looks, the fear of child protective services, the granola bars split unevenly so Sophie could eat more, the dreams of houses that Sophie drew every morning because she had never had one of her own. And now this. Garrison handed Grace the key. It was warm from being in his pocket, worn smooth from Walter's hands over decades of use. It felt like history in her palm, like possibility, like something sacred. I will leave you to get settled. Garrison's voice was gentle. There is a care package inside, food and firewood to get you started. I will come back in a few days to check on you, bring any supplies you need, but for now it is all yours. Sophie took the key from Grace's hand. She approached the front door like it was something holy, something that might disappear if she moved too fast or breathed too hard. She fitted the key into the lock, turned it slowly, felt it give with a click that seemed to echo through the clearing. The door swung open with a soft creak of hinges that needed oiling. Warm air rolled out, carrying the scent of wood smoke and pine and something else. Something that felt like peace. Something that felt like coming home to a place you had never been but had always been waiting for. Sophie stepped over the threshold first, Grace right behind her, and together they entered Walter Hartley's cabin. Their cabin now. Sophie whispered the words, her voice full of awe and gratitude, and the kind of hope that Grace had thought was lost forever. We have a home. The first morning in the cabin, Sophie woke to silence so complete it felt like the world had been remade overnight. No traffic sounds, no voices from other cars in the parking lot, no mechanical hum of refrigerated trucks making deliveries. Just birds. Dozens of them, calling to each other through the forest in a language she did not understand but desperately wanted to learn. She lay in the smaller upstairs bedroom, Walter's quilts heavy and warm around her, and watched sunlight move across the pine plank ceiling in patterns that shifted with the breeze outside. Her stuffed rabbit sat on the windowsill, looking out at mountains that seemed close enough to touch. And for the first time in her 9 years, Sophie understood what the word home actually meant. It meant safety. It meant permanence. It meant waking up in the same place you fell asleep, knowing you would still be there tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. It meant walls that belonged to you and a roof that could not be taken away and a door you could close against the world when the world became too much. Sophie got out of bed and went to the window. The view made her breath catch. Mountains rising against a sky so blue, it hurt to look at. Forests stretching away in every direction. A clearing of brown grass and wildflowers gone dormant for winter. And smoke rising from the chimney below, which meant her mother was awake, had already started a fire in the wood stove, was making breakfast in a kitchen that was actually theirs. She dressed quickly in clothes that smelled like the cedar chest she had found them in, clothes that must have belonged to someone Walter knew, because they were too big for Sophie, but small enough that a child could have worn them eventually. Then she went downstairs to find her mother. Grace stood at the kitchen window watching the clearing outside, a mug of coffee in her hands. The hand pump at the sink had taken some getting used to, her nursing school muscles remembering the rhythm after a few tries. The water that came up was so cold and clear, it tasted like it had never touched anything human before. The wood stove radiated steady heat. Walter's carefully split kindling, catching easily from the fire Grace had built using techniques half remembered from a camping trip 20 years ago. Coffee percolated in an ancient enamel pot, and Grace allowed herself to feel something dangerously close to contentment. Morning, baby. She turned when she heard Sophie on the stairs. Sleep okay? Best sleep ever. Sophie came to stand beside her mother at the window. I did not wake up once, not even from bad dreams. Grace put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. They stood together in the warm kitchen, looking out at the land that was theirs now, and neither of them spoke for a long time. There was nothing that needed to be said. Everything was in the silence, in the peace, in the simple fact of being somewhere safe and permanent after so long without either. The cabin revealed itself slowly over the following days, each room a careful study in self-sufficiency. Walter had built this place to last, had designed every detail with survival and comfort in mind. The workshop in the back held tools organized with military precision, each one clean and oiled and hung on pegboard with its outline traced in marker so you knew exactly where it belonged. Hammers and shears and chisels and planes, wrenches and screwdrivers and files of every size. Everything a man might need to build anything he could imagine, maintained with the care of someone who understood that tools were not just objects, but extensions of the hands that used them. The root cellar stayed cool even when Grace built the fire high. Shelves lined with mason jars full of preserves that were probably still good. Vegetables Walter had grown and put up himself. Tomatoes and beans and corn and pickles, labeled in his neat handwriting with dates going back years. A lifetime of summers captured in glass and waiting to be opened. Upstairs, his bedroom held almost nothing personal. A narrow bed, a dresser, a single photograph on the wall. Grace studied that photograph for a long time. A young man in army fatigues standing next to a helicopter. Jungle visible in the background. A face that had not yet learned what war would teach it, what horrors it would witness, what scars it would carry for the rest of its days. Walter James Hartley, Vietnam, 1967. He had been barely older than a boy in that picture. 19 or 20, with eyes that still held hope, with a smile that still believed in things. Grace wondered what had happened to that boy, what he had seen that made him need 43 acres of wilderness and 37 years of solitude to feel safe again. Sophie made discoveries daily, her child's curiosity uncovering things Grace's practical mind might have missed. A carved wooden box under the eaves held Walter's war medals, Bronze Star and Purple Heart wrapped in cloth that had kept them from tarnishing. Sophie held them carefully, understanding that they represented something important, even if she did not fully grasp what. A bookshelf in the main room concealed a fold-down desk behind a false front. The surface was scarred with decades of use and covered in Walter's careful handwriting. Lists, calculations, observations about weather and wildlife and the slow passage of seasons. A record of a life lived in intimate contact with the natural world. She found bird nests tucked into the porch rafters, a family of mice living in the woodshed who scattered when she opened the door, and a trail through the forest that led to a creek so clear you could count individual stones on the bottom. It was Sophie who first noticed something odd about the main room's dimensions. She had been measuring things with a tape measure from Walter's workshop, making a map of the cabin in her notebook with careful attention to scale. Her father, whoever he was, had never taught her anything. But her grandfather had taught Grace, and Grace had taught Sophie, and now Sophie was using those lessons to understand her new home. She measured the exterior wall of the main room, 42 feet from corner to corner. She measured the interior rooms, the living area, the kitchen, the small pantry by the back door. 38 feet total. She measured again, got the same numbers. 4 feet were missing, unaccounted for, too much to be explained by insulation and log thickness, too precise to be a mistake. She found Grace in the upstairs bedroom, replacing a broken pane in one of the windows. "Mom," Sophie's brow was furrowed in concentration, "I think there is a secret room." The tape measure proved Sophie right. Grace walked the perimeter of the main floor, counting her steps, then did the interior and came up 4 feet short each time. The math did not lie. 4 feet of space existed somewhere that they could not see. They studied the walls together, looking for seams or breaks in the logs, tapping on surfaces and listening for hollow sounds. Everything appeared solid and continuous, built with the kind of craftsmanship that did not leave gaps or errors. The stone fireplace dominated the north wall, massive and beautifully constructed from river rock fitted together with barely visible mortar. Grace ran her hands over the stones, looking for anything that might move, anything that might give, anything that might explain where 4 feet of cabin had disappeared to. Sophie examined the carved mantel with its patterns of leaves and vines and birds. The carving was exquisite, detailed beyond anything Grace had seen outside of museums. Walter had spent years on this, maybe decades, adding birds one at a time in the long winter evenings when the snow piled high and there was nothing to do but work with his hands. She counted the birds as she studied them. Hawks and owls, songbirds and woodpeckers, sparrows and finches and robins and jays, Dozens of species, each one rendered with such precision you could almost hear them singing. And then she noticed it. One bird was different from the others. A small wren near the bottom right corner of the mantel. The carving was slightly deeper than those around it. The wood smoother, as if someone had touched it repeatedly over years, wearing it down with the oil and friction of human skin. Sophie pressed it experimentally. It gave slightly inward. There was a soft click, and then a sound that made Grace's heart stop. Stone grinding against stone. Somewhere behind the fireplace, something was moving. Something hidden for decades was finally being revealed. A section of floor in front of the hearth separated from the rest. A hairline crack appeared as dust that had settled into the seam suddenly broke free. The panel was 4 feet square, perfectly fitted, and it lifted on some kind of counterweight mechanism when Grace worked her fingers into the crack and pulled. Stone steps descended into darkness, narrow and steep, carved directly into the bedrock foundation. Grace found a flashlight in Walter's workshop, tested it to make sure the battery still held charge, stood at the top of those steps and tried to decide if she was brave enough to go down, if she was ready to see whatever Walter Hartley had hidden beneath his cabin for 37 years. Sophie pressed against her side, not scared, vibrating with excitement. Her absolute faith that whatever waited below would be good, would be another gift, would be one more piece of the puzzle falling into place. Grace took her daughter's hand. Together, they descended into the darkness. The stairs ended 12 feet down in a chamber that took Grace's breath away. The ceiling was vaulted, supported by hand-hewn beams that must have taken months to shape in place. The walls were smooth stone, worked and finished to a polish that reflected the flashlight beam, and shelves lined them from floor to ceiling, organized with the same meticulous care as the workshop upstairs. Wooden crates stacked carefully, each labeled with numbers and dates in Walter's precise script. Leather-bound books arranged by size. Glass-fronted cabinets holding objects Grace could not immediately identify in the flashlight's beam. And in the center of the chamber, a massive oak desk with papers arranged in neat stacks and a journal lying open, as if Walter had just stepped away for a moment and would return any second. Sophie moved to the desk while Grace stood frozen, her nurse's brain trying to process what she was seeing and coming up blank. The journal's open page showed columns of items and numbers, dates ranging from the early 1960s through the 1990s, each entry meticulously documented with the precision of an accountant who had never lost his gift for numbers. Sophie picked up the journal carefully, both hands supporting the leather binding, and brought it to her mother. The title page read Private Collection and Estate Records, property of Walter James Hartley, begun January 7, 1963. Updated through September 2, 2018. Below that, in slightly different ink, as if added later, a note that made Grace's knees go weak. For Grace and Sophie, should you find this, everything here is yours now. I trust you will know what to do. Grace's hands shook as she turned pages. The flashlight balanced on the desk cast shadows that made the numbers seem to dance. Entry after entry, each one listing an item purchased, the price paid, authentication details, and current estimated value. A landscape painting by Albert Bierstadt, bought at an estate sale in Portland for $375 in 1968. Current estimated value $85,000. A first edition of The Great Gatsby, Scribner's 1925, purchased for $45 at a bookstore closing sale in Seattle in 1971. Current estimated value $180,000. 100 shares of Apple Computer, purchased at IPO in 1980 for $2,200. Current value $4.2 million. The numbers grew as Grace flipped forward through the years. Paintings by artists she vaguely recognized from art history classes she had taken in nursing school. Andrew Wyeth, Mary Cassatt, Winslow Homer. Stock certificates from companies that had seemed like risky bets at the time, but had become household names. Microsoft, Amazon, Google. Sophie pulled open the nearest crate using a pry bar she found leaning against the desk. Old enough to know to be careful, but too curious to wait. Yellowed newspaper from 1972 wrapped around a painting. Oil on canvas. Mountains and a lake rendered in dramatic strokes that made the scene feel alive. The signature in the corner matched the journal entry, a Bierstadt. Grace lifted it carefully. The frame was solid wood, gone dark with age. She leaned it against the desk where they could see it better in the flashlight beam. The painting alone, according to Walter's notes, was worth enough to buy a house. A nice house. Maybe several. They spent hours in that underground room, opening crates and cabinets with increasing amazement. Each discovery more impossible than the last. A bronze sculpture of a running horse, patina green and beautiful. Ancient coins in velvet-lined cases. Roman and Byzantine and Chinese, each labeled with acquisition, date, and provenance. First edition books by Twain and Hemingway and Fitzgerald. Their dust jackets protected in archival sleeves. A framed map from 1702 showing territories that did not exist anymore. Hand-colored and gorgeous. Financial ledgers revealed stock purchases that had multiplied 100-fold, bonds that had matured and been reinvested. A patient and disciplined approach to building wealth that had compounded over decades into something almost unimaginable. The final page of the main journal stopped Grace's breath completely. Walter's neat handwriting, dated September 2nd, 2018, 6 months before his death. Final accounting as of this date. Total estimated value of collection based on current market conditions and professional appraisals, completed August 2018. Paintings and sculptures, $73,200,000. Rare books and manuscripts, $18,500,000. Coins and precious metals, $42,800,000. Stocks and bonds, $112,300,000. Miscellaneous items, $18,200,000. Total estimated value, $265 million. Grace read the number 3 times. Her vision blurred. Her knees gave way, and she sat down hard on the stone floor. $265 million. Hidden in a vault under a cabin in Montana. Left by a man who lived alone for 37 years and apparently never told anyone what he had been building down here. She looked at Sophie, who was carefully examining a collection of jeweled brooches in a glass case, and tried to understand what this meant. What it changed. What Walter had given them that went so far beyond a roof over their heads it defied comprehension. 3 days ago, they had been sleeping in a car. Now they were worth more than $250 million. The world had tilted on its axis, and nothing would ever be the same again. Grace sat on the stone floor of the vault for a long time after Sophie had gone back upstairs to bed. The flashlight battery was fading, casting long shadows across the walls, making the paintings in their crates look like windows into other worlds. Worlds where $265 million did not exist. Worlds where a homeless mother and her daughter had not just become richer than most people could imagine. She held Walter's journal in her lap, but she was not reading the financial entries anymore. She had turned to the back, to a section she had almost missed in the shock of the numbers. A section written in a different hand than the careful columns of figures. Looser, more personal, the handwriting of a man who was not recording data, but speaking directly to someone he would never meet. A letter, addressed to her. Dear Grace, if you are reading this, you have found my vault. You have seen what I built over 37 years. And you are probably wondering why I'm. Let me tell you a story. I came back from Vietnam in 1970. I was 22 years old. I had seen things that no human being should ever see. Done things that still wake me in the night, even now, even after all these years. The doctors call it PTSD now. Back then, they called it weakness. Told me to shake it off, to be a man, to stop dwelling on the past. I tried. God knows I tried. Got a job as an accountant in Seattle. Was good at it. Numbers made sense to me in a way people never did. But I could not handle the world anymore. The noise, the crowds, the way a car backfiring could send me diving for cover in the middle of the street. So I disappeared. Bought this land with everything I had, built this cabin with my own hands, and I started watching. Watching the markets, watching the world, watching your family. I attended your grandfather's funeral your father's wedding in 1979, your christening in 1986. I stood in the back, never spoke to anyone, but I watched, and I learned. I learned that Caroline cheats on her taxes and her husband's. I have documentation. I learned that Marcus has a gambling problem that has cost him 3 marriages and $200,000. I have records of his debts. I learned that Diane lies about medical emergencies to get money from people who care about her. I have copies of her real medical records next to the fake ones she uses for sympathy. I learned that Kevin invests other people's money in schemes that always fail, then blames everyone but himself. I have tracked every dollar he has lost. And I learned about you. I watched you care for your father when he was dying. Watched you sit by his bedside for weeks while your siblings made excuses. Watched you spend your inheritance on his funeral while they spent theirs on themselves. I watched you give them money when they asked. $40,000 over 2 years. Money you could not afford to lose. Money they never intended to repay. I watched them abandon you, block your calls, pretend you did not exist, leave you and Sophie to sleep in a car while they lived in houses bought with your generosity. And I decided, you are the only one worth saving, the only one who gives instead of takes, the only one who deserves what I have built. They will come, Grace. When they learn about this inheritance, they will come. They will smile and pretend they care. They will claim they are worried about you, about Sophie, about the money being mismanaged. They will hire lawyers and file papers and try to take everything I have given you. Do not let them. In the fireproof safe under this desk, you will find what you need to fight them. Documentation of every lie they have told, every dollar they have stolen, every promise they have broken. I have been collecting evidence for 30 years. I have also prepaid a legal team. Amanda Chen handles estates. David Stone handles guardianship disputes. They know you are coming. They are ready to fight. You are stronger than you know, Grace. Stronger than they want you to believe. You have survived things that would have broken most people. You have raised a daughter alone, kept her safe and loved, and hopeful despite everything. Do not let them take that from you. Do not let them win. This is yours, all of it, earned not by blood but by character. Your uncle, Walter James Hartley. P.S. There is a separate letter for Sophie in the small wooden box next to the safe. She will need it when she is older. When she understands what it means to be the kind of person who gives instead of takes. Grace read the letter 3 times. Then she put her head in her hands and wept. Not from sadness, not from grief, from something she could not name. Relief, maybe. Vindication. The knowledge that someone had seen her, had watched from a distance and understood what her life had really been, had looked at her family and seen through the masks they wore, the lies they told, the cruelty they disguised as concern. Walter had known everything, had predicted exactly what would happen and prepared for it decades in advance. She was not alone anymore. She found the safe where Walter said it would be, a small fireproof box bolted to the floor under the desk. The combination was written in his letter, a date that meant nothing to her but clearly meant something to him. The lock clicked open, and inside she found exactly what he had promised. Folders, dozens of them, each one labeled with a sibling's name, each one thick with documents and photographs and records that painted a picture of who they really were. Caroline's folder contained tax returns showing income she had hidden from the IRS, screenshots of texts with men who were not her husband, records of a lawsuit she had settled out of court after being accused of fraud by a former client. Marcus's folder held casino receipts going back 15 years, letters from collection agencies, a bankruptcy filing he had managed to keep secret from the rest of the family. Diane's folder was the thickest, medical records from 3 different doctors showing no evidence of the conditions she had claimed required emergency surgery, credit card statements showing spa treatments and designer clothes purchased the same week she had begged Grace for money to pay for medication. Kevin's folder contained investment prospectuses for companies that had never existed, emails promising returns that were mathematically impossible, complaints filed with the SEC that had never resulted in charges but painted a clear picture of a pattern. And beneath the folders, a VHS tape, old and slightly worn, labeled in Walter's handwriting with 2 words, if necessary. Grace did not have a way to play it, did not know what was on it, but she knew it was important, knew Walter had left it for a reason, knew that whatever was recorded on that tape might be the weapon she needed when her siblings finally came. Because they would come. Walter had known it. She knew it too. $265 million was too much money to ignore. Too much for people who had already proven they would take everything she had without a second thought. The only question was when. She got her answer exactly 1 week later. The first sign of trouble came from Martha Perkins, the librarian in Cedar Falls. Grace and Sophie had driven into town for supplies, their first real trip since arriving at the cabin. The general store had everything they needed, canned goods and flour and sugar, batteries for the flashlights, warm clothes that actually fit Sophie instead of the oversized things they had found in the cabin. Martha was waiting for them outside the library when they finished shopping. 65 years old, gray-haired, sharp-eyed. The kind of woman who knew everyone's business because in a town of 847 people, everyone's business was common knowledge. "You are Walter's niece." Martha's voice was warm, but her eyes were worried. "The one from the letter." Grace felt her stomach tighten. "What letter?" "He wrote to me before he died. Told me someone would come to claim the cabin. Described you perfectly. Said you were good people, and the town should help you if you needed it." "That sounds like Walter." Grace managed a smile despite the unease spreading through her chest. "Private but thoughtful." Martha nodded, but her expression did not change. "I need to tell you something. I might have made a mistake." "What kind of mistake?" "I told some people you were here. Not many, just a few folks at the diner. But you know how small towns work. Word spreads, and this morning there was a reporter from the Helena Chronicle asking questions. About Walter, about you, about the inheritance." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. "A reporter? I did not tell him anything." Martha's voice was firm. "Sent him away with a flea in his ear. But someone must have talked to him before me. He already knew about the property, about Walter's collection." Grace's mind raced. The property records were public. The will was filed with the court. Anyone who knew where to look could find out that she had inherited 43 acres and a cabin from a reclusive uncle. But the collection, the vault, the $265 million. Only she and Sophie knew about that, and Robert Garrison, who had helped Walter set up the trust. Unless someone had been watching, unless someone had noticed the appraisers Walter had hired over the years, unless the art world had whispered about a mysterious collector in Montana who never sold anything, but occasionally had pieces authenticated. The story broke 3 days later. Montana hermit leaves fortune to homeless single mother. Grace found out when her phone started ringing. Numbers she did not recognize. Voicemails from reporters asking for interviews. Text messages from people she had never met wanting to know if the story was true. And then the call from Caroline. Grace almost did not answer. Her finger hovered over the ignore button, every instinct screaming at her to let it go to voicemail, to avoid all the confrontation she knew was coming. But something made her pick up. Maybe she wanted to hear what Caroline would say. Maybe she wanted to know how her sister would try to spin this. "Grace!" Caroline's voice was bright, concerned, the voice of a real estate agent who had just learned her listing price had tripled. "I have been trying to reach you for days. I saw the news story. Honey, that is amazing news about Uncle Walter's estate." Grace said nothing, waited. "I know we have had our differences." Caroline's voice softened, became more intimate. "But this is family business now. A collection worth that much money needs professional management. Marcus and I have been talking, and we think it would be best if we came up to help you sort through everything." Still Grace said nothing. "You must be overwhelmed." Caroline pressed on, filling the silence. "A cabin in the middle of nowhere with no experience managing assets like this. Someone could take advantage of you. You need family around you at a time like this." Grace finally spoke. Her voice was flat, controlled. The voice of a woman who had spent 2 years learning to hide her emotions from people who would use them against her. "I am handling it." "Handling it?" "Grace, be realistic. This is potentially worth hundreds of millions of dollars. You cannot manage this alone. You do not have the expertise, the connections, the financial literacy. Walter left it to me." Grace cut her off. "To me and Sophie, specifically. He had his reasons." Caroline's mask slipped. Just for a second, Grace could hear the frustration underneath the concern, the calculation underneath the warmth. "Listen to me carefully." Caroline's voice went cold. "You are living in a shack in the woods with no running water. You are not exactly in a position to make good decisions. Someone needs to step in before you destroy everything that old man spent his life building." Grace hung up. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear, from anger, from the sheer audacity of Caroline's assumptions, from the absolute certainty in her sister's voice that Grace was incapable, that Grace needed help, that Grace would inevitably fail without the guidance of people who had already proven they could not be trusted. She thought about Walter's letter, about the folders in the safe, about the evidence he had gathered over 30 years. They were coming, just like he said they would. But this time Grace would be ready. The day they arrived was unseasonably warm for November, the kind of false spring that Montana sometimes offered before the real winter set in. Snow melted on the peaks, mud sucked at boots on the Forest Service road, and 3 expensive vehicles that had no business being on a dirt track struggled up the mountain toward the cabin. Grace saw them coming from the porch. A BMW X5 in the lead, Caroline's car, bought with commissions from deals Grace did not want to know the details of. Behind it, a Land Rover Defender with rental plates, Marcus showing off even when he was driving someone else's vehicle. And bringing up the rear, a Mercedes sedan that must have bottomed out a dozen times on the rocks and ruts. They parked in the clearing in front of the cabin. Doors opened, figures emerged. Carolyn first, 44 years old, perfectly groomed, wearing clothes that cost more than Grace had earned in her best month as a nurse. Her smile was wide and warm and completely false. Marcus next, 42, already sweating despite the cool air, his face red with the effort of the drive, or maybe just the anticipation of the money he thought he was about to claim. He wore a suit that did not fit quite right, as if he had lost weight recently or gained it, or simply never learned how clothes were supposed to hang on a body. Diane third, 36, playing the concerned sister with practiced precision. Her eyes were red-rimmed, as if she had been crying, though Grace knew she could produce tears on command. She had seen Diane do it 100 times over the years, turning on the waterworks whenever sympathy might get her something she wanted. And with them, two people Grace did not recognize. A man in an expensive suit carrying a briefcase, and a woman with a professional camera, already taking photographs of the cabin, the clearing, the mountain backdrop. Grace did not move from the porch. Sophie stood beside her, one hand gripping the railing, her small face set in an expression of determination that made her look older than 9. Well, well, Caroline's voice carried across the clearing. There you are. We have been worried sick about you. Grace still did not move, did not smile, did not offer any of the hospitality that her upbringing told her she should. What do you want, Caroline? The warmth flickered in Caroline's eyes. Annoyance underneath. She was not used to Grace standing up to her, was not used to anyone standing up to her. We came to help, honey. This is a lot for anyone to handle alone. The man in the suit stepped forward, extending a business card that Grace did not take. Richard Blackwell. His voice was smooth, professional, the voice of a lawyer who charged $500 an hour and was worth every penny if you were the one paying him. I represent your siblings in this matter. What matter? Your inheritance. Blackwell's smile did not reach his eyes. Your family has concerns about your capacity to manage an estate of this size, your history of housing instability, your lack of financial experience, the remote location of the property. These are all factors that suggest you might benefit from guidance. Grace felt Sophie press closer to her side, felt her daughter's hand slip into hers, small fingers squeezing tight. I do not need guidance. With respect, Ms. Hartley, I think you do. Blackwell's voice hardened slightly. We will be filing a petition for guardianship based on concerns about your ability to manage substantial assets, your recent history of homelessness, your current living situation, which lacks basic utilities that most courts would consider necessary for a child, your isolation from support systems and professional resources. The words hit Grace like blows, each one calculated, each one designed to make her feel small, incapable, unworthy of what Walter had given her. Marcus stepped forward, his face twisted with something that might have been anger or might have been desperation. We are family, Grace. That collection should be split 5 ways. It is not fair that Walter left everything to you just because you happen to be convenient. Sophie's voice cut through before Grace could respond, high and clear and shaking with fury. My mom is not convenient. She is good. And you took Grandpa's money and left us in a parking lot. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds in the trees seemed to stop singing. Diane recovered first. Her face crumpled into an expression of wounded concern. Sophie, sweetheart, you do not understand. We all had our own problems. We wanted to help your mother, but she made it so difficult. You are lying. Sophie's voice did not waver. You always lie. Uncle Walter knew. He wrote it all down. Caroline's eyes narrowed. What do you mean he wrote it down? Grace squeezed Sophie's hand. A warning. Do not say more than you need to. Do not give them anything they can use. It does not matter what Uncle Walter wrote. Grace kept her voice steady. What matters is that he left this property to me and Sophie. Not to you, not to Marcus, not to Diane, to us. And we are going to prove you are not competent to manage it. Blackwell's smile had turned predatory. We are going to show a court that you are unstable, financially irresponsible, and unable to provide a suitable environment for your daughter. We are going to have you removed as trustee and appointed as guardians of both the estate and the child. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Guardians of the child. They were not just coming for the money, they were threatening to take Sophie. Grace felt something cold settle in her chest, something hard and sharp and absolutely certain. Get off my property. This is not over. Carolyn turned on her heel, gesturing for the others to follow. You will hear from our lawyers within the week. They drove away in a spray of gravel, their expensive vehicles struggling on the rough road. Grace watched them go until they disappeared around the bend, until the sound of their engines faded to nothing, until the forest was quiet again except for the birds and the wind and her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then she went inside, picked up the phone, and called Robert Garrison. The sheriff arrived 2 hours later. John Martinez was 55 years old, a veteran of 20 years in Jefferson County law enforcement. He had known Walter Heartland, had been one of the few people the old man actually talked to, had checked on him during bad winters and made sure he had what he needed to survive. When Garrison called him about the situation at the cabin, Martinez came immediately. He walked the property with Grace, examining the tracks the vehicles had left, noting the positions where people had stood. His face was grim, but not surprised. He had seen this kind of thing before. Family turning on family when money was involved. Then he stopped, squatted down next to the Ford Focus, which Grace had finally retrieved from Helena with Garrison's help. He shone his flashlight under the car, reached beneath the frame, and came up holding something small and black. Grace's stomach dropped. GPS tracker. Martinez held it up so she could see. Looks like it was placed within the last couple of weeks. Someone has been monitoring your location. My siblings? Most likely. He bagged the device carefully. This is illegal surveillance, Ms. Hartley, stalking under Montana law. I am going to document this and file a report. If they come back, if they try anything else, you call me directly. He handed her a card with his personal cell number written on the back. Walter was a good man. Martinez's voice was quiet but fierce. Kept to himself, but when the forest fires came through in 2012, he helped evacuate families. Drove his truck up and down this mountain until everyone was safe. This community does not forget that kind of thing. Thank you, Sheriff. Martinez looked at the cabin, at the mountains rising behind it, at the land Walter had loved enough to spend 37 years protecting. Whatever they try, we have your back. The town, I mean. Cedar Falls takes care of its own. After he left, Grace sat on the porch and watched the sun set over the mountains. Sophie was inside doing homework at the kitchen table, a normal activity that felt surreal after everything that had happened. The GPS tracker sat in an evidence bag on the railing, a small black reminder that her siblings had been watching her, tracking her, planning their attack before she even knew it was coming. But Walter had known, had prepared, had left her everything she needed to fight back. The phone rang, a number she did not recognize but somehow knew was important. Ms. Hartley? A woman's voice, calm and professional. My name is Amanda Chen. Robert Garrison gave me your number. I understand you might need some help. Walter mentioned you in his letter. He mentioned you at his letters to me. Amanda's voice warmed slightly. For 15 years, he wanted to make sure you would be protected when this day came. Are you ready to start planning? Grace looked out at the mountains, at the land that was hers, at the home Walter had built with his own hands and filled with 37 years of careful preparation. Yes, her voice was steady. I am ready. The next weeks blurred together in a haze of preparation. Amanda Chen arrived from Missoula 2 days after the phone call, 53 years old, sharp-eyed, the kind of woman who had spent her career fighting for people who could not fight for themselves. She brought folders of her own, strategies, precedents, a plan for every move Grace's siblings might make. David Stone came from Billings, 48, calm, specializing in exactly the kind of guardianship dispute Carolyn and her lawyer had threatened. He had won 94% of his cases. He intended to make this one of them. They sat at Walter's handmade kitchen table, the three of them plus Robert Garrison, and built Grace's defense piece by piece. The documentation Walter had gathered was devastating. 30 years of evidence showing exactly who her siblings really were. Tax fraud, hidden debts, fake medical emergencies, failed investments with other people's money. A pattern of behavior that painted a clear picture of people who took and never gave anything back. But that was just the foundation. They needed more. Character witnesses from Cedar Falls testified to Grace's capability, to Sophie's well-being, to the way the community had embraced them in the short time they had been there. Martha Perkins from the library, Sheriff Martinez with his report on the GPS tracker, the owner of the general store who had seen Sophie laughing and healthy and full of energy. A doctor from Helena examined Sophie and pronounced her thriving, better than thriving. The girl was reading 2 years above grade level. Her emotional development was remarkably stable for a child who had been through what she had been through. The cabin environment, far from being harmful, seemed to be exactly what she needed. Two independent psychologists evaluated Grace. Both concluded she was mentally competent, more than competent. She showed remarkable resilience, clear thinking under pressure, and a fierce protective instinct for her daughter that was the opposite of the instability her siblings claimed. Sister Agnes made the 3-hour drive from Tacoma. Her testimony would be powerful. She had known Grace for 10 years, had seen her at her lowest and watched her refuse to break, had witnessed her give help to others even when she had nothing herself. The case was building. The walls were going up. Grace was no longer defenseless. But there was still the matter of the videotape. They found a VCR in the attic, dusty and old, but still functional. Grace held the tape Walter had left in the safe and wondered what was on it. What final weapon he had prepared for the battle he knew was coming. They gathered in the main room to watch. Grace and Sophie, Garrison and Amanda and David. The fire crackling in the wood stove, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Grace pressed play, static for a moment. Then a face, Walter's face. Older than in the photograph from Vietnam, but still recognizable, still carrying that same careful attention in his eyes. He was sitting in this vault, the shelves of paintings and books visible behind him, the desk where Grace had found his journal, the place where he had spent decades building something no one else knew existed. "My name is Walter James Hartley." His voice was clear, strong, the voice of a man who had thought about what he wanted to say for a very long time. Today is March 15th, 2018. I am of sound mind and body, as will be attested by my doctor Richard Patterson and my attorney Robert Garrison. He paused, looked directly at the camera, directly at whoever would eventually watch this recording. I am making this video because I know what is going to happen after I die. I have watched my family for 50 years, attended their gatherings when I could stand to be around people, funerals mostly, and I have seen what they are. Caroline cheated on her first husband and framed him for the affair and the divorce. I have the photographs in the private investigator's report. Marcus owes money to people who break legs when they do not get paid. I have the records of his gambling debts and the names of his creditors. Diane has collected over $40,000 in donations for medical conditions she does not have. I have her real medical records and the fake ones she shows to get sympathy. And I watched Grace. I watched her care for her father when no one else would. Watched her give away money she could not afford because her family told her they needed it. Watched them abandon her when there was nothing left to take. She is the only one worth saving. Walter leaned forward in the video, his eyes intense. If you are watching this in a courtroom, it means they came for her. Just like I knew they would, it means they filed papers claiming she cannot manage what I left her. It means they are trying to take everything because that is what they do. They take. But I prepared for this. Everything I have belongs to Grace Hartley and her daughter Sophie. This is not a gift I am giving them. It is a recognition of what they deserve. For years of kindness in a family that punished kindness. For hope in circumstances that should have destroyed hope. For being the kind of people who give instead of take. Blood does not make family. Character does. And theirs is the only character in this family worth a damn. The screen went to static. The room was silent. Grace realized she was crying. Had been crying since Walter started speaking. Tears streaming down her face for a man she had barely known, but who had known her completely. Amanda was the first to speak. Her voice was hushed but fierce. This changes everything. This proves he knew exactly what he was doing. Proves he anticipated their claims and prepared evidence to counter them. Any judge who sees this will understand exactly what kind of people we are dealing with. David nodded. We do not show this until the right moment, until they have committed to their narrative, until they have gone on record claiming they just want to help. Then we show them who Walter really thought they were. Garrison put his hand on Grace's shoulder. He believed in you, Grace. Completely. He spent 30 years getting ready for this moment because he knew you would need it. Grace wiped her eyes, looked at Sophie, who had been watching silently, her small face solemn. What do you think, baby? Sophie was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful. I think Uncle Walter was really smart, and I think he was really lonely, And I think he loved us even though he never met us. I think you are right. Grace pulled her daughter close. I think that is exactly right. The phone rang later that evening. A number Grace did not recognize but somehow felt compelled to answer. Grace, a man's voice. Hesitant, uncertain. It is Kevin. Grace's hand tightened in on the phone. Her youngest brother. The one she had practically raised after their mother died. The one whose business ventures she had funded with money she could not afford to lose. What do you want, Kevin? I wanted to tell you something. His voice cracked slightly. I am out. I withdrew my name from the petition. Grace said nothing, waited. I have been thinking about what we did to you. What I did. Taking your money. Promising to pay it back. Disappearing when things got hard for you. And I cannot do this anymore. Why now? Why not before? Because I finally looked at myself. Really looked. And I did not like what I saw. There was a long pause. Grace could hear Kevin breathing on the other end of the line. Could almost see him running his hand through his hair the way he had done since he was a little boy, the nervous gesture he had never outgrown. Caroline borrowed money to pay for the lawyers. Kevin's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Against her house. She is betting everything that she can get control of Uncle Walter's estate and pay it back before anyone notices. And Marcus is desperate. He owes people, Grace. Bad people. He sees this inheritance as his only way out. What about Diane? Diane just wants whatever she can get, same as always. And you? I just want to stop being the person I have been. Kevin's voice broke completely. I know you cannot forgive me. I do not deserve it. But I wanted you to know that at least one of us finally woke up. At least one of us sees what we did to you. Grace closed her eyes, thought about the brother she had loved, the little boy who had followed her around the house, the young man she had believed in despite all evidence to the contrary. Thank you for telling me, Kevin. Grace, he hesitated. They are not going to stop. Caroline is desperate now. Marcus is dangerous. Please be careful. He hung up. Grace sat in the gathering darkness and thought about what he had said. About Caroline betting her house on the outcome of this fight. About Marcus owing money to people who hurt those who did not pay. The stakes were higher than she had realized. Her siblings were not just greedy, they were cornered. And cornered animals were the most dangerous kind. She looked at the fireproof safe in the corner of the room, at the folders Walter had gathered, at the videotape that would destroy any claim they tried to make. Walter had prepared her for this battle, had given her weapons and armor and allies. Now all she had to do was win. The court date was set for the first week of December. 3 weeks away, 3 weeks to prepare. 3 weeks to gather every piece of evidence, every witness, every argument that would prove Grace was exactly who Walter had believed her to be. And 3 weeks for her siblings to do their worst. Grace knew they would not wait quietly, knew they would look for weaknesses, search for leverage, try to find some way to shift the balance in their favor. The GPS tracker proved they had been watching her for weeks. What else were they capable of? She found out on a Tuesday morning when she drove into Cedar Falls for supplies and found a stranger waiting for her outside the general store. A woman in a business suit, out of place among the pickup trucks and mud-covered boots, holding a folder, smiling with teeth that were too white and eyes that were too calculating. Ms. Hartley, I am from Child Protective Services. We have received a report about the living conditions of your daughter. Grace's blood went cold. A report from who? The woman's smile did not waver. I am not at liberty to say, but the concerns raised are serious enough that we need to conduct an assessment. I would like to see your home, speak with your daughter, evaluate whether the environment is suitable for a child. Behind the woman across the street, Grace saw a car she recognized, a BMW X5. And behind the wheel, watching with undisguised satisfaction, was Carolyn. This was their move, their attempt to shift the balance. If they could get CPS to question her fitness as a mother, it would support their petition, would make the court more likely to side with them, would maybe even give them grounds to take Sophie away while the case was being decided. Grace looked at the woman from CPS, looked at Caroline across the street, looked at the folder in the woman's hands that probably contained lies and exaggerations and twisted versions of the truth. Then she pulled out her phone and called Sheriff Martinez. The next hour was the longest of Grace's life. Martinez arrived within 15 minutes. He spoke with the CPS worker in low tones while Grace stood on the sidewalk and tried not to shake. Tried not to imagine Sophie being taken away. Tried not to give Caroline the satisfaction of seeing her break. Finally, the CPS worker walked over, Her expression had changed. The predatory smile was gone, replaced by something more uncertain. Sheriff Martinez has vouched for your living conditions and your daughter's well-being. Her voice was clipped, professionally neutral. We will need to conduct a proper assessment at some point, but it does not appear there is an emergency situation requiring immediate intervention. She drove away without another word. Caroline's BMW pulled out shortly after, disappearing down the road toward Helena. Sheriff Martinez stood next to Grace, his face hard. Anonymous report my ass. He watched Caroline's car disappear. I know exactly who made that call, and I know exactly what she was trying to do. Can you prove it? Not yet, but if she tries anything else, I will find a way. Grace looked at the mountains rising above the town, at the sky that seemed bigger here than anywhere else she had ever been, at the community that had closed ranks around her without being asked. Walter had told her she was not alone, that the town would help her if she needed it. She was beginning to understand what he meant. 3 weeks until the court date. 3 weeks to survive whatever else her siblings threw at her. Grace squared her shoulders and walked back to her car. She had a battle to prepare for, and she intended to win. The Jefferson County Courthouse had stood since 1923. 100 years of disputes and decisions, of families torn apart and put back together, of justice served and justice denied. Its stone columns were weathered by decades of Montana winters. Its halls echoed with the accumulated weight of every case that had passed through these rooms. Grace walked up the steps at 8:30 on a Thursday morning in December. Sophie's hand tightened hers, Amanda Chen and David Stone flanking them like shields. The sky threatened snow despite the early hour, clouds hanging low and gray over the mountains that ringed Helena on all sides. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed against wood paneling dark with age. The air smelled of floor wax and old paper, and the particular tension that came from families tearing each other apart in public. Grace saw her siblings before they saw her. Carolyn stood near the water fountain at the end of the hall, navy suit perfectly tailored, hair styled like she was about to close $1 million sale rather than try to steal one from her sister. She was speaking in low tones with Richard Blackwell, their lawyer, who nodded along with the patient attention of a man charging $600 an hour. Marcus paced by the windows that looked out on the parking lot. His tie was slightly crooked. His face was already flushed with the anger that seemed to be his permanent state these days. He kept checking his phone as if waiting for a message, as if something more important than his sister's future was demanding his attention. Diane sat on a wooden bench near the courtroom doors, hands folded in her lap, eyes downcast, playing the role of concerned family member with practiced precision. She wore black, as if in mourning, as if she were the victim in all of this rather than the perpetrator. When Caroline spotted Grace, her expression shifted. The mask slipped for just a moment, and Grace saw what was underneath. Not concern, not family loyalty, just cold calculation and barely contained frustration that Grace had not simply handed over what she wanted. They did not approach each other, did not speak, just stood on opposite ends of the hallway like armies waiting for the battle to begin. Sophie pressed closer to Grace's side, and Grace squeezed her daughter's hand, trying to transmit strength she did not entirely feel. Everything they had, everything Walter had given them, came down to the next few hours, and whether a judge would see through her siblings' performance to the truth underneath. Cedar Falls had sent the delegation. Grace had not asked them to come, but they had come anyway. Martha Perkins with her folder of newspaper clippings about Walter's life. Sheriff John Martinez in full uniform. His presence a statement about who the law was actually here to protect. The owner of the general store who had extended credit when Grace first arrived. The doctor who had examined Sophie and pronounced her thriving. Sister Agnes had made the 3-hour drive from Tacoma. 70 years old and still fierce, still determined, still committed to protecting women who had been failed by the people who should have loved them most. They formed a wall of witnesses to character, to resilience, to the difference between people who talked about family and people who actually showed up when it mattered. The bailiff opened the courtroom doors at 9 o'clock sharp. Everyone filed in, found their seats, arranged their papers and their faces into expressions appropriate for what was about to happen. Grace sat at the defense table with Amanda and David. Sophie was beside her, quiet but alert, taking in everything with those serious dark eyes that saw too much for a child her age. Across the aisle, Caroline and Marcus and Diane arranged themselves behind Richard Blackwell. A united front, a family concerned about their vulnerable sister. The performance was polished, believable, the kind of thing that might convince someone who did not know what they had done. The judge entered at 9:15. Victoria Hammond was 63 years old, silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, wire-rimmed glasses that made her look like a school principal from another era. She had been on the bench for 25 years, had presided over hundreds of custody battles and estate disputes, and had developed immunity to manipulation that came from seeing every trick in the book. She surveyed the courtroom with eyes that missed nothing, took in the crowd of supporters behind Grace, the expensive lawyers behind Caroline, the 9-year-old girl sitting straight-backed at the defense table. "All rise!" The bailiff's voice echoed off the high ceiling. "Court is now in session. The Honorable Victoria Hammond presiding." Everyone stood, then sat, then waited while the judge arranged her papers and read through preliminary documents with an expression that gave nothing away. "Case number 7492. Her voice was clear and measured. "Petition for guardianship of Grace Hartley and custody of minor child Sophie Hartley. Mr. Blackwell, you filed the petition. Present your case." Richard Blackwell rose with the confidence of a man who had done this hundreds of times. His suit cost more than Grace had earned in her best month as a nurse. His shoes gleamed under the fluorescent lights. His voice carried practiced concern as he began to speak. "Your Honor, my clients come before this court with deep worry for their sister and niece. Grace Hartley has, through no fault of her own, found herself in circumstances that raise serious questions about her ability to manage a substantial estate and provide appropriate care for her daughter." He paused for effect, looked at Grace with an expression of sympathy that did not reach his eyes. "The record shows that Ms. Hartley was homeless for approximately 2 years prior to inheriting this property. She and her daughter lived in a vehicle, moved from parking lot to parking lot, without stable housing or employment. She has no experience managing financial assets of any kind, let alone an estate valued at over $200 million. He walked slowly toward the judge's bench, hands clasped behind his back. "The property she inherited is located in an extremely remote area. No power lines, no municipal water, miles from the nearest town or medical facility. For an adult who chooses this lifestyle, that is one thing. For a 9-year-old child who has no choice in the matter, it raises serious concerns about safety and welfare." He turned to face the courtroom, his voice taking on a note of righteous concern. "My clients are not seeking to take anything from their sister. They are seeking to protect her, to ensure that this unexpected windfall is managed responsibly, to make certain that young Sophie has the stable, safe environment every child deserves." Grace watched the performance with something between anger and admiration. Blackwell was good, very good. He painted a picture that was technically true in its details but completely false in its implications. Yes, she had been homeless. Yes, the cabin was remote. Yes, she had no experience managing millions of dollars. But none of that meant she was incapable. None of that meant her daughter was unsafe. None of that justified taking away everything Walter had left them. Blackwell called his first witness. Marcus Hartley took the stand with the solemnity of a man about to deliver a eulogy. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and proceeded to lie through his teeth. "I have watched my sister struggle for years." His voice cracked with manufactured emotion. "We all have. She makes poor decisions, trusts the wrong people, cannot seem to get on stable ground. When our father died, we tried to help her, offered her money, advice, a place to stay, but she pushed us away, insisted she could handle things on her own." He shook his head sadly. "And look where that got her, living in a car with her daughter. No jamoito, no home, no future. When we heard about Uncle Walter's estate, our first thought was relief. Finally, she would have resources. Finally, she could get back on her feet." He paused, looked at Grace with an expression of wounded concern. "But then we learned about the conditions. A cabin in the wilderness with no utilities. An art collection worth hundreds of millions that requires specialized knowledge to maintain. Financial assets that need professional management. And we realized that without help, without guidance, she would lose everything. Just like she lost everything before." Grace's hands clenched in her lap. Every word was a lie, every expression was calculated. Marcus had never offered her help, had taken her money and disappeared, had blocked her calls when she begged for what she was owed. But she could not scream that from the defense table, could not interrupt his performance, could only sit and watch and wait for her turn. Caroline testified next. "She wore her concern like a designer dress, perfectly fitted, expertly tailored. Her voice trembled at all the right moments. Her eyes glistened with tears that seemed to appear on command. I love my sister, Carolyn dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. I have always loved her, but love means being honest about someone's limitations. Grace has never been good with money, never been good at making practical decisions. She leads with her heart instead of her head. And while that is a beautiful quality in many ways, it is dangerous when millions of dollars are at stake. She leaned forward slightly, as if confiding a secret to the judge. The cabin has no electricity from the grid, no running water from municipal sources. The nearest hospital is over an hour away. What happens if Sophie gets sick in the middle of the night? What happens if there is a fire, an accident, an emergency of any kind? These are not conditions that any reasonable person would consider appropriate for raising a child. The tears came now, perfect and crystalline, sliding down Caroline's carefully made-up cheeks. I want my niece to be safe. I want my sister to have the support she needs. That is all any of us want. Diane's testimony was softer, less aggressive, playing a different note in the symphony of concern. She spoke about trauma, about the toll that years of instability must have taken on Grace's mental health, about the way people sometimes made decisions that seemed rational to them, but appeared alarming to outside observers. I worry about her judgment. Diane's voice was gentle, almost pitying. Living alone in the wilderness, isolated from any support system, responsible for a young child and a fortune she has no idea how to manage. What if she trusts the wrong person? What if someone takes advantage of her? What if the pressure becomes too much? She looked at Sophie with an expression of tender concern that made Grace want to scream. That little girl has been through so much already. She deserves stability. She deserves safety. She deserves to know that the adults in her life are making good decisions on her behalf. The morning session ended at noon. Grace sat in a small conference room with Amanda and David and Sophie, picking at a sandwich she could not taste, trying to calm the storm raging in her chest. They are good, Amanda's voice was matter of fact. Professional. They have clearly rehearsed this. But their whole case rests on the assumption that past struggle equals present incompetence. We are going to tear that apart. David spread papers across the table. We start this afternoon with the bank records, the texts and emails, the documented history of what they actually did versus what they claimed they wanted to do. Sophie had been quiet all morning, watching, listening, taking everything in with that preternatural focus she had developed over years of learning to read situations for danger. Mom, her voice was small but steady. When do I get to talk? Grace looked at Amanda, who nodded. This afternoon, sweetheart, after David presents our evidence. Are you sure you want to do this? Sophie's jaw set in that way that made her look so much older than 9. I am sure. They are lying about you. Someone needs to tell the truth. The afternoon session began at 1:30. David Stone rose from the defense table with none of Blackwell's theatrical flourish. His voice was calm. His manner was measured. He spoke like a man who had facts on his side and did not need to dress them up with emotion. Your Honor, this morning we heard testimony about concern, about family wanting to help, about worry for a vulnerable sister and her child. He picked up a folder from the table, thick with documents. This afternoon, I would like to show the court what that concern actually looked like when Grace Hartley needed it most. He handed copies to the judge, to Blackwell, to the court reporter. These are bank records covering the period from August 2022 through March 2023. During this time, Grace Hartley transferred a total of $40,000 to her siblings in response to their requests for help. Loans, they called them. Emergency assistance. He flipped through the pages. $8,000 to Caroline Hartley Ross in October. $11,000 to Marcus Hartley in November. $6,000 to Diane Hartley in December. $15,000 to Kevin Hartley in January. He looked at Caroline, Marcus, and Diane in turn. Not one of these loans was ever repaid. Not one. He pulled out another set of documents. These are text messages and emails from Grace Hartley to her siblings during the months following these transfers. Requests for repayment, explanations that she was struggling. Pleas for help when she lost her job and could not pay rent. He read from the page. Caroline, please, I need that money back. I cannot make rent. Sophie and I are going to lose our apartment. He turned to another message. Marcus, you promised to repay me by February. It is now April. Please call me back. And another. Diane, I know you said your surgery was an emergency, but I am having an emergency now. Please, I am begging you. He set down the folder. The responses to these messages are notable primarily for their absence. No replies, no explanations. In several cases, Grace's phone number was blocked entirely. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. David continued, while Grace Hartley was losing her apartment, while she was living in her car with her daughter, while she was washing Sophie's school clothes in gas station bathrooms and splitting granola bars so her child could eat, her siblings were living in comfortable homes purchased or maintained with money she had given them. He picked up another folder. We have documentation of Caroline's home sale during this period, which netted her a profit of over $200,000. Documentation of Marcus's continued membership at a country club costing $8,000 per year. Documentation of Diane's medical records, which show no evidence of the surgical emergency for which she claimed to need $6,000. Blackwell rose. Objection. This is not relevant to the question of Ms. Hartley's competence to manage an estate. Judge Hammond looked at him over her glasses. It is directly relevant to the credibility of witnesses who testified this morning about their concern for Ms. Hartley's welfare. Overruled. David nodded his thanks and continued. The petitioners claim they tried to help Grace Hartley. The record shows they took everything she had and then abandoned her when there was nothing left to take. He turned to face the judge directly. They claim they are worried about her ability to manage Walter Hartley's estate. But Walter Hartley knew exactly who they were. He watched them for decades. He documented their behavior. And he specifically chose to leave his entire fortune to Grace and her daughter because he understood that she was the only member of this family with the character to deserve it. The witnesses from Cedar Falls testified one after another. Martha Perkins spoke about Walter, about the man she had known for 20 years, about his careful intelligence and his clear thinking right up until the end. He was not a fool. Her voice was firm. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he chose Grace because he saw something in her that her own family refused to see. Sheriff Martinez presented his evidence about the GPS tracker, explained the legal implications of surveillance and stalking, testified that in his professional opinion, the Hartley siblings had been monitoring Grace's movements for weeks before they filed their petition. This was not spontaneous concern. His voice was hard. This was a planned operation to take control of assets they believed they were entitled to. The doctor who had examined Sophie testified about her health, her development, her emotional stability. This child is thriving. His voice carried the authority of 30 years in medicine. She is well-nourished, intellectually advanced, emotionally resilient. Whatever her mother has been doing, it is working. There is no evidence whatsoever that Sophie Hartley is in any danger or suffering any harm. Sister Agnes spoke last. She walked to the witness stand with the measured pace of a woman who had spent her life delivering hard truths. Her face was lined with decades of service. Her eyes held the kind of compassion that came only from having seen the worst of humanity and choosing to believe in the best anyway. I have known Grace Hartley for 10 years. Sister Agnes's voice was steady. I remember the night she came to our shelter. 19 years old, a baby in her arms, bruises on her face, running from a man who had beaten her. She paused. Let the image settle in the courtroom. She worked 2 jobs while she got her nursing degree, volunteered at the shelter even after she moved out, gave money she could not afford to families who had less. When her father was dying, she quit her job to care for him because no one else would. She looked at Caroline and Marcus and Diane. I saw her at her lowest point, living in a car with her daughter because the family members who should have helped her took her money instead. And even then, even at rock bottom, she never stopped fighting for her child. Sister Agnes turned to face the judge. You want to know if Grace Hartley is competent? She is one of the most competent, resilient, determined people I have ever known. She has been tested in ways that would break most of us, and she has not broken. That is not incompetence. That is extraordinary strength. Then it was Sophie's turn. Grace had agonized over this decision for weeks. Sophie was only 9. The courtroom was intimidating. The questions would be personal. The opposing lawyers might try to confuse her or twist her words. But Sophie had insisted, had practiced with Amanda until she knew what to expect, had written down what she wanted to say, and memorized it so she would not forget under pressure. And when the bailiff called her name, she walked to the witness stand with her chin up and her shoulders back, looking like a child playing at being brave until you saw her eyes and realized the bravery was real. The oath was modified for a minor witness. The judge asked Sophie if she understood she needed to tell the truth. Sophie said yes, She understood, and her voice did not waver. Amanda approached the witness stand gently. Sophie, can you tell the court about your life before you came to Montana? Sophie took a breath. Her hands gripped the armrests of the witness chair, but her voice was clear. We lived in our car, Mom and me, for almost 2 years. Can you describe what that was like? Sophie thought for a moment, choosing her words carefully. We slept in parking lots, different ones, so security would not tell us to leave. Mom made a schedule so we always knew where we would be. She taught me how to tell the time by when different places were safe and when they were not. She paused. We used baby wipes to wash because we did not always have access to bathrooms. We ate granola bars and peanut butter sandwiches because they did not need to be refrigerated. Mom always gave me the bigger half, even though she thought I did not notice. How did your mother take care of you during this time? Sophie's eyes found Grace across the courtroom. She never let me miss school. Not once, even when it was raining, even when she was sick. She walked me to the bus stop every morning. She helped me with homework at the library. She made sure I had clean clothes for school, even if she had to wash them in a gas station sink. The courtroom was utterly silent. She never made me feel like we were poor. Sophie's voice grew stronger. She never made me feel like it was my fault or like I should be ashamed. She told me that lots of families go through hard times and that it was not about what we did not have, but about what we did have. Each other. Amanda nodded. What did you have? Sophie answered without hesitation. We had each other. We had love. We had hope that things would get better. And they did. Amanda asked the next question carefully. Sophie, your aunts and uncles say they are worried about you, that they want to help you and your mother. What do you think about that? Sophie's jaw set. Her eyes hardened. The 9-year-old girl disappeared and something older took her place. I think they are lying. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Hammond silenced it with a look. Why do you think that, Sophie? Because they were not worried when we were living in the parking lot. Sophie's voice did not waver. They were not worried when Mom called them asking for help and they would not answer. They were not worried when we had nowhere to sleep and nothing to eat. She looked directly at Caroline, at Marcus, at Diane. They only came when there was money. They only care because Uncle Walter left us something valuable. If the cabin was just a cabin, if there was no collection, they would not be here. They would still be ignoring us. Sophie reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was worn at the edges, clearly handled many times. Uncle Walter wrote me a letter. She held it carefully. He wrote it before I was ever born, before he even knew there would be a me. But he knew there would be someone like me someday, and he knew what would happen when his family found out about his collection. She unfolded the paper. He said to be brave. He said to protect my mom because she had spent her whole life protecting me. He said that blood does not make family, character does. Her eyes swept the courtroom. Uncle Walter never met me, but he knew me better than the aunts and uncles who were sitting right there. He knew what kind of people they were, and he knew what kind of person my mom was. She looked at the judge. My mom is the strongest person I know. She kept me safe when we had nothing. She never gave up on me. She never made me feel like I was a burden or a problem. She made me feel loved every single day, even when loving me was the hardest thing in the world. Tears were streaming down Sophie's face now, but her voice stayed steady. These people want to take me away from her. They want to say she cannot take care of me, but they are wrong. She takes care of me better than anyone ever could. Sophie folded the letter and put it back in her pocket. I am not afraid to live in the cabin. I am not afraid of bears or snow or being far from town. I am afraid of being taken away from my mom. That is the only thing in the world that scares me. Blackwell rose for cross-examination, but Judge Hammond held up her hand. I have heard enough from this witness. The child is clearly intelligent, articulate, and bonded to her mother. Any further questioning would be unnecessarily traumatic. Sophie returned to the defense table and slid into the chair next to Grace. Grace put her arm around her daughter and pulled her close, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, not caring who saw or what they thought. Amanda Chen stood. Your Honor, we have one final piece of evidence. A video recording made by Walter Hartley 6 months before his death. Blackwell objected. We have not been provided with this recording in discovery. Amanda handed a document to the bailiff. We only recently located this recording in a fireproof safe at the property. It was sealed and marked to be opened only in the event of legal proceedings against Ms. Hartley. Mr. Garrison can confirm the circumstances of its discovery. Judge Hammond studied the document, looked at Blackwell, looked at Amanda. I will allow it. Proceed. A television was wheeled into the courtroom. A VCR connected to it. Amanda inserted the tape and pressed play. Static for a moment. Then Walter's face filled the screen. He looked older than in the photograph from Vietnam, but his eyes were the same. Clear, sharp, seeing everything. My name is Walter James Hartley. His voice was strong despite his age. Today is March 15, 2018. I am recording this because I know what is going to happen after I die. He paused, looked directly at the camera. If you are watching this in a courtroom, it means they came. My nieces and nephews, Caroline and Marcus and Diane and Kevin. It means they filed papers claiming Grace cannot manage what I left her. It means they are trying to take everything because that is what they do. He leaned forward. I have watched this family for 50 years. I have attended their gatherings when I could bear to be around people. And I have seen who they really are. His voice hardened. Caroline cheated on her first husband and framed him for the affair. I have the photographs and the private investigator's report. They are in my files. Marcus has gambling debts he has hidden from everyone. He owes money to people who hurt those who do not pay. I have records of every dollar. Diane has collected over $40,000 for medical emergencies that never existed. I have her real medical records next to the fake ones. He shook his head slowly. They took $40,000 from Grace when she could not afford to lose it. They promised to pay her back. They never did. Then they disappeared, blocked her calls, pretended she did not exist while she lived in a car with her daughter. His eyes seemed to look through the screen directly at Grace. I chose Grace because she is the only one worth saving, the only one who gives instead of takes, the only one who kept her integrity when everyone around her was losing theirs. He straightened in his chair. This collection is mine. I built it over 37 years. Every painting, every book, every coin, every stock, and I have the right to leave it to whoever I choose. I choose Grace Hartley and her daughter Sophie. Not because of blood. Blood means nothing to me. I share blood with people who would steal from their own sister without a second thought. I choose them because of character. Because Grace proved who she was through years of kindness in a family that punished kindness. Because she kept hoping when hope made no sense. Because she raised a daughter alone and did it right despite everything. Walter's voice grew fierce. Blood does not make family. Character does. And theirs is the only character in this family worth a damn. He paused, let the words hang in the air. If the court has any questions about my mental state, my doctor and my lawyer can confirm I was of sound mind when I made this recording. Every decision I made was deliberate. Every document in my files is authentic. I knew this day would come. I prepared for it. And I am asking the court to honor my wishes. Give Grace and Sophie what I left them. Let them build a life with it. Let them prove that sometimes, even in families like mine, the good ones win. The screen went to static. The courtroom was silent. Grace looked at her siblings. Carolyn had gone pale. Her perfectly applied makeup could not hide the shock. Marcus was sweating, his hands gripping the table in front of him. Diane had stopped crying, her face frozen in an expression that might have been fear. They had expected a senile old man who could be written off as incompetent. They had found a careful strategist who had anticipated their every move and prepared for it decades in advance. Judge Hammond removed her glasses and pinched the bridge of her nose. We will take a 30-minute recess. When we return, I will deliver my ruling. The 30 minutes felt like 30 hours. Grace sat in the conference room with Sophie and Amanda and David. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Everything that could be done had been done. Everything that could be said had been said. Now they could only wait. Sophie leaned against Grace's shoulder, exhausted from her testimony. Her eyes were closed, but Grace knew she was not sleeping, just resting, gathering strength for whatever came next. The bailiff appeared in the doorway. Court is back in session. They filed back into the courtroom, took their seats, faced the judge. Victoria Hammond looked out over the assembled faces. Her expression was unreadable. Her voice, when she spoke, was measured and precise. I have presided over many cases in my 25 years on this bench. Custody disputes, estate contests, family members fighting over money and property, and the remains of people they claim to love. She paused. This case is both typical and exceptional. Typical in its basic elements. A family fighting over an inheritance. Claims of incompetence used to try to wrest control from the designated heir. Money revealing the true character of people who might otherwise have hidden it. She looked at Caroline and Marcus and Diane. Exceptional in the preparation of the deceased. Walter Hartley spent 30 years anticipating this moment, gathering evidence, building a case that his chosen heir would be able to use in her defense. He knew his family, he knew what they would do, and he was ready. She picked up a sheet of paper. The petitioners have presented a case based on Grace Hartley's past homelessness and lack of financial experience. These are true facts. Ms. Hartley did live in her car with her daughter for approximately 2 years. She does not have a background in managing large estates. Grace's heart clenched. But these facts do not lead to the conclusion the petitioners suggest. The judge's voice sharpened. Ms. Hartley became homeless not through her own failures, but through the deliberate betrayal of the very people now claiming she cannot care for herself. She gave them money she could not afford. They took it and abandoned her. The evidence is overwhelming and uncontradicted. She looked at Grace. Far from demonstrating incompetence, Ms. Hartley's history demonstrates remarkable resilience. She maintained her daughter's school attendance throughout their period of homelessness. She kept Sophie healthy, educated, and emotionally stable under circumstances that would have broken many people. She found a way to survive when every system that should have supported her failed. She turned back to the petitioners. The witnesses for the petitioners testified about their concern for their sister, but their actions tell a different story. GPS trackers on her vehicle, anonymous calls to Child Protective Services, decades of financial exploitation followed by complete abandonment. Her voice went cold. Walter Hartley saw all of this. He documented it. He prepared for exactly this moment. And his video testimony makes clear that his choice of heir was not random or impulsive, but the result of 50 years of careful observation. She set down her paper. The petition for guardianship is denied. Relief flooded through Grace like a wave. Furthermore, Judge Hammond continued, I am ordering the petitioners to pay all legal fees incurred by the respondent in defending against this action. The filing was not made in good faith, but as an attempt to circumvent the clear wishes of the deceased. She looked at Caroline directly. I am also issuing a restraining order. Carolyn Hartley Ross, Marcus Hartley, and Diane Hartley are prohibited from approaching within 500 feet of Grace Hartley or Sophie Hartley. Any violation will result in immediate arrest. Caroline's face crumpled, the mask finally falling away completely. Finally, the judge's voice softened slightly. I want to address the child. She looked at Sophie. Young lady, I have been doing this job for a long time. I have heard many children testify about their parents, some honestly and some not. Your testimony today was among the most compelling I have ever witnessed. Your mother is lucky to have you, and I suspect she knows it. Sophie managed a small smile. Walter Hartley left his estate to the right people. I have no doubt about that. This case is closed. The gavel came down. The courtroom erupted. Not in chaos, but in release. The tension that had been building for hours finally breaking. Supporters from Cedar Falls embracing each other. Sister Agnes crossing herself and murmuring a prayer of thanks. Sheriff Martinez nodding with grim satisfaction. Grace sat very still for a long moment, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to believe it was really over. Sophie threw her arms around her neck. We won, Mom. We won. Grace held her daughter and let herself cry. Not tears of sadness or fear, but tears of relief and gratitude, and the overwhelming knowledge that for once, finally, impossibly, justice had been done. Across the courtroom, Carolyn was arguing with Blackwell in furious whispers. Marcus had his head in his hands. Diane was crying, but for once the tears seemed real. They had lost. They had come for everything and walked away with nothing, less than nothing. Legal fees and restraining orders and the public exposure of exactly who they were. Grace looked at them and felt no satisfaction, no triumph, just exhaustion and relief and a bone-deep desire to go home. Home, the cabin in the mountains, the land Walter had loved, the vault full of treasures he had spent 37 years collecting. Hers now, really hers, legally and permanently and beyond any challenge. She stood up from the defense table, took Sophie's hand, and walked out of the courtroom into the cold December air. The sky had cleared while they were inside. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting them in shades of pink and gold. Snow glittered on the peaks. Sophie looked up at the sky, at the mountains, at the future that stretched out before them. Can we go home now, Mom? Grace squeezed her daughter's hand. Yes, baby. We can go home. The drive back to the cabin took 2 hours. 2 hours of winding roads and lengthening shadows in a silence that felt different from any silence Grace had known before. Not the silence of fear or exhaustion or despair. the silence of peace, of something finally being finished. Sophie fell asleep halfway there, her head against the window, her breath fogging the glass in small clouds that appeared and disappeared with each exhale. Grace glanced at her daughter in the rearview mirror and felt something loosen in her chest that had been clenched tight for years. It was over. Really over. The judge had ruled. The restraining orders were in place. Her siblings could not touch them anymore. She should have felt triumphant, should have felt the satisfaction of justice served, of enemies defeated, of wrongs finally made right. Instead, she felt hollow, scraped out, like the fear that had driven her for so long had finally released its grip and left nothing behind but exhaustion. The cabin was dark when they arrived. Grace carried Sophie inside, laid her on the bed in the upstairs room, pulled Walter's quilts over her small body. Then she went back downstairs and sat in the chair by the window and watched the moon rise over the mountains. She did not sleep that night, did not even try, just sat in the darkness and let her mind wander through everything that had happened. The parking lots, the granola bars, the lies she had told to protect Sophie from the truth of how bad things really were. The letter from Robert Garrison, the drive to Montana, the cabin that turned out to be real, that turned out to be more than real, that turned out to be everything Walter had promised and more. The vault, the paintings and books and coins, the $265 million that still did not feel possible, that still felt like a dream she might wake from at any moment. Her siblings, their performance in the courtroom, the mask falling away when the video played and they realized Walter had seen through them all along. And Sophie, her daughter on the witness stand, telling the truth with a courage Grace had not known a 9-year-old could possess, defending her mother to a room full of strangers, refusing to let the people who had betrayed them win. Grace put her head in her hands and wept, not tears of joy or relief, something deeper, something that had been building for years and was only now finding its way out. The grief of everything she had lost, the rage at everything that had been taken from her, the bone-deep exhaustion of fighting for so long with no one to help her. She cried until there was nothing left, until the hollow feeling was gone and something else was there instead. Something that might have been hope, something that might have been the beginning of healing. The sun rose over the mountains, pink and gold and impossibly beautiful. Grace watched it through the window and made herself a promise. She would not waste what Walter had given her, would not let his 37 years of preparation be for nothing, would build something with this fortune that would honor his memory and help people who had been where she was. People who had been abandoned by the ones who should have loved them most. People who had nothing left but each other. People who deserved a chance. The first 6 months after the trial were harder than Grace had expected. She had thought winning would fix everything. Had thought that once the legal battle was over, once the threat was neutralized, she would be able to relax, to breathe, to finally feel safe. Instead, she found herself jumping at shadows, checking the locks on the doors 3 times before bed, waking in the night with her heart pounding, certain she had heard a car on the Forest Service road, certain her siblings had found a way around the restraining orders, certain everything she had won was about to be taken away. The nightmares were the worst. Dreams where the judge changed her mind, where Caroline showed up with new lawyers and new papers and a new strategy that worked, where Sophie was taken away by CPS workers who refused to listen, where Grace woke up back in the Ford Focus with nothing but the clothes on her back and the knowledge that it had all been a cruel fantasy. She went to see a doctor in Helena, a woman named Patricia Torres who specialized in trauma, who had worked with veterans and abuse survivors and people who had lived through things they should not have had to live through. PTSD, Dr. Torres said it gently but directly. You have been living in survival mode for years. Your nervous system has been on high alert for so long that it does not know how to turn off. Even now, when the danger is past, your body is still waiting for the next threat. Can it be fixed? It can be managed. Dr. Torres smiled slightly. Healing takes time. You spent years learning to be afraid. You cannot unlearn that overnight, but you can learn new patterns, new responses. You can teach your body that it is safe now. Grace went to therapy twice a week for the first 3 months. Then once a week, then every other week. She learned techniques for managing the panic when it rose. Learned to recognize the triggers that sent her spiraling. Learned to breathe through the moments when her heart raced and her hands shook and everything in her screamed that danger was coming. Slowly, painfully, she began to believe that safety could be permanent. Sophie had her own adjustments to make. She started school in Cedar Falls in January, the only new student in a class that had known each other since kindergarten. Small town dynamics. Everyone curious about the girl from California who lived in the cabin up the mountain, whose mother had inherited millions from the local hermit. She came home the first day quiet, withdrawn, not crying but close to it. They asked a lot of questions, she told Grace, about the money, about the trial, about why we were homeless before. What did you tell them? Sophie shrugged. The truth. We went through hard times, but we are okay now. Some of them thought it was cool that we used to live in a car, like we were adventurers or something. And the others? Sophie's face clouded. Some of them think we do not deserve what Uncle Walter left us, that we are just lucky, that rich people are all snobs. Grace knelt down to Sophie's level. People will always have opinions about things they do not understand. What matters is that we know the truth. We know what we went through. We know what Uncle Walter saw in us. That is enough. Sophie nodded slowly. Then she hugged Grace tight. I am glad we are here, Mom, even if it is hard sometimes. Me too, baby, me too. Spring came late to the mountains. Snow lingered on the peaks until May, and even then the nights stayed cold enough for frost. But when the thaw finally arrived, it arrived with force. The creek behind the cabin swelled with snowmelt. Wildflowers erupted across the meadow. The forest came alive with birdsong and the rustle of animals emerging from their winter hiding places. Grace stood on the porch one morning and watched Sophie running through the meadow with a jay they had adopted from the shelter in Helena, a mutt named Bear who had been abandoned and rescued and given a second chance, just like them. Sophie's laughter echoed off the mountains, pure and free, and full of a joy Grace had almost forgotten existed. She thought about the parking lots, the granola bars, the three outfits rotated endlessly, the lies Sophie had learned to tell to protect her mother's pride. All of it felt like another lifetime now, like something that had happened to someone else. A truck appeared on the Forest Service road. Grace tensed automatically, her hand moving toward the phone in her pocket, the old fear rising before she could stop it. Then she recognized the vehicle, Robert Garrison's battered Chevy, making its way up the mountain. But Garrison was not driving. The man behind the wheel was younger, mid-40s maybe, dark hair going gray at the temples, a face that looked like it had seen things it would never talk about. He parked in the clearing and got out, walked toward Grace with a slight limp that spoke of old injuries that had never quite healed. Miss Hartley? His voice was quiet. Careful, I am Thomas Brennan. Bob Garrison sent me. Said you might be looking for someone to build a community center. Grace had mentioned the idea to Garrison a few weeks ago, a vague notion, still forming, something to do with Walter's money that would help people. A place where women like her could come for help when everything else had failed. You are a carpenter? Among other things. Brennan looked at the cabin, at the mountains, at the clearing surrounded by forest. I did 2 tours in Afghanistan, construction battalion. We built schools and hospitals and infrastructure in places that had been blown apart. When I came back, I could not do anything else. Building things is all I know. There was something in his eyes, a recognition, a familiarity with shadows that matched her own. Walter was a veteran too, Grace said. I know. Brennan nodded. Bob told me about him, told me what he built here, what it meant to him. He looked at Grace directly. I understand about needing a place to heal. I have spent the last 10 years looking for mine. Maybe I can help you build yours. The community center took 8 months to construct. Brennan worked slowly, carefully, with the same attention to detail that Walter had brought to the cabin. He sourced timber from local mills, hired workers from Cedar Falls who needed the jobs, built something that looked like it had always been there, that belonged to the landscape instead of fighting against it. Sophie became his shadow, following him around the construction site, asking questions about tools and techniques and the mysteries of building something from nothing. He taught her to measure and cut, to drive nails straight, to see the structure hidden inside a pile of raw materials. Grace watched them work together and felt something shift in her chest, something that had been frozen for a long time beginning to thaw. She was not ready for another relationship, did not know if she would ever be ready. The scars from Sophie's father ran deep, and the years of survival had not left much room for trust. But Brennan did not push, did not demand, just showed up every day and did his work and treated Sophie like she mattered and treated Grace like she was capable of deciding things for herself. It was enough. For now, it was enough. The Walter Hartley Foundation for Single Mothers opened its doors 18 months after the trial. The community center sat on a rise overlooking the meadow. Timber frame construction, solar panels on the roof, a great room with windows that framed the mountains like paintings, offices for the staff they had hired, a kitchen that could feed 50 people, a library stocked with books for children and adults alike. Behind the main building, 20 tiny homes spread across the property, small but complete, each one with a bedroom, a bathroom, a kitchen. Everything a mother and her children might need to start over. The services were comprehensive: legal aid for women dealing with custody disputes or restraining orders or the bureaucratic maze of escaping abuse, job training programs for those who needed new skills, counseling for trauma, childcare while mothers attended classes or interviews, emergency funds for those who needed help with rent or medical bills or the 100 other crises that could derail a fragile recovery. Grace had hired carefully social workers who understood that judgment did not help and kindness did, lawyers who believed that everyone deserved representation regardless of ability to pay, teachers who saw potential in people the world had written off. Amanda Chen served on the board, so did Sister Agnes, making the drive from Tacoma 4 times a year to oversee operations and remind everyone why they were doing this. The foundation did not advertise, did not seek publicity. Word spread the way it always did in communities where women whispered to each other about safe places and helping hands. They came slowly at first, 1 or 2 a month, women with bruises they tried to hide, women with children who had learned to flinch at loud noises, women who had been told they were worthless until they believed it. Then more. Word spreading faster now. A shelter in Missoula referring cases, a church in Butte sending families who had nowhere else to go. The network growing organically, one desperate phone call at a time. By the end of the first year, they had helped 127 women and their children. By the end of the second year, that number had doubled. Grace kept meticulous records, not for the sake of donors or publicity, but because Walter had taught her the importance of documentation, of knowing exactly where you stood, of being able to prove what you had accomplished when someone inevitably came to question it. The numbers were real. The faces were real. The lives changed were real. And Walter's money, carefully managed, carefully invested, kept growing, kept generating the income that made all of it possible. Sophie turned 14 in the spring of the 5th year. She was taller now. Her brown hair had darkened. Her serious eyes had not changed, still seeing too much, still understanding more than most adults gave her credit for. But there was a lightness to her now that had not been there before, a confidence that came from years of stability, of safety, of knowing that tomorrow would come and it would be okay. She helped at the foundation on weekends, played with the younger children, tutored kids who were behind in school, showed them the trails through the forest, the creek where you could catch crawfish, the meadow where deer came to graze at dawn. She still drew in her notebook, but the pictures had changed. No longer just houses with 3 figures holding hands. Now she drew the women who came through the foundation's doors, the children who arrived frightened and left smiling, the mountains that had become her home. She called Grace one evening from the community center. "Mom, there is something I need to tell you." Grace felt the old fear spike, then forced it down. "What is it?" "I want to speak at the Memorial Garden dedication next month. I have been writing something. I want to read it in front of everyone." The Memorial Garden had been under construction for 6 months, a half-acre of native plants and walking paths and benches for reflection. At its center, a granite monument carved with words Grace had chosen from Walter's letters. It was meant to be unveiled at a ceremony, commemorating the 5th anniversary of the foundation's opening, a celebration of everything they had built, a tribute to the man whose vision had made it all possible. "Are you sure, baby? There will be a lot of people there." Sophie's voice was steady. "I am sure. Uncle Walter wrote me a letter before I was born. He told me to be brave. I want to show him I listened." 247 people gathered for the dedication. Women who had come through the foundation's programs and rebuilt their lives. Residents of Cedar Falls who had embraced Grace and Sophie as their own. Veterans from across Montana who had heard about Walter and wanted to honor a fellow soldier. Lawyers and social workers and donors and journalists who had learned about the foundation's work and wanted to see it for themselves. The day was warm. Late spring in Montana, the mountains still capped with snow, but the valley green and alive with new growth. The memorial garden sprawled across the hillside behind the community center, a patchwork of wildflowers and native grasses broken by winding stone paths. The granite monument stood at the center, 8 feet tall, polished smooth on the face where the inscription had been carved. Grace stood at the podium set up before it and looked out at the crowd, at the faces of people whose lives had intersected with hers because of one quiet man who had spent 37 years preparing for a gift he would never see delivered. She thought about the parking lot behind Walmart, the Ford Focus with its failing heater and its dwindling gas tank. The mornings when she had allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to cry before facing another day of survival. 5 years since the letter from Robert Garrison had arrived. 5 years since she had driven 950 miles with nothing but hope and desperation to guide her. 5 years since she had discovered that Walter Hartley had seen her when no one else had. She began to speak. 5 years ago, my daughter and I were homeless. We lived in a car. We split granola bars for breakfast and washed our clothes in gas station bathrooms and lied about where we lived because the truth was too shameful to speak out loud. Her voice carried across the garden, steady, clear. I had given everything I had to family members who promised to help me and then disappeared. I had lost my job, my apartment, my faith in the people who should have loved me most. I had nothing left but a 9-year-old daughter who deserved better than anything I could give her. She paused, let the words settle. Then a letter arrived from a man I had met twice in my life, a man who had watched me from a distance for decades and decided I was worth saving. Walter Hartley was a veteran, a builder, a collector, a hermit who chose solitude not because he hated people, but because the world was too loud for him after everything he had seen. He spent 37 years in these mountains, building his cabin with his own hands, growing his collection piece by piece, watching the markets and the world and the family he had never really been part of. And in all that time, he never stopped paying attention. Grace looked at the monument, at the words carved into the stone. He saw my siblings for what they were, saw them take and never give anything back, saw them abandon me when there was nothing left to take. And he saw me. He saw me care for my father when no one else would, saw me give money I could not afford to people who did not deserve it, saw me fight for my daughter when everything in the world seemed set against us. He decided I was worth protecting, worth believing in, worth leaving everything he had spent his life building. She felt tears on her cheeks, did not wipe them away. I never got to thank him, never got to tell him what his gift meant, never got to show him what we would build with the chance he gave us. But I can show all of you. She gestured at the community center, at the tiny homes, at the gardens and paths and the mountain rising behind them all. 847 women have come through these doors in 5 years. 847 mothers who had nowhere else to go, who had been beaten down by life and circumstance, and the people who should have helped them. We gave them shelter, legal help, job training, counseling, a safe place to heal and a chance to start over. Not thousands, not millions, 847. That is the number. That is what we have done. That is Walter Hartley's legacy. She looked at Sophie, standing at the edge of the crowd, waiting for her turn to speak. My daughter wants to say something now. She's been working on this for weeks. She insisted on being part of this ceremony because Walter left her a letter too. Because even though he never met her, he knew exactly who she would become. Grace stepped back from the podium. Sophie walked forward. She was 14 years old, tall for her age, wearing a dress she had picked out herself, blue like the Montana sky, simple and elegant. Her notebook was tucked under her arm, the same notebook she had been drawing in since she was 9, filled now with 5 years of images that documented their transformation. She reached the podium and looked out at the crowd, at the faces watching her, at the mountains rising behind them all. Then she began to speak. When I was 9 years old, my mom and I lived in a car. Her voice was clear, unwavering. We parked in Walmart parking lots and rest stops and any place we could find that would not kick us out before morning. I wore the same 3 outfits to school. I told my friends we were moving soon, that our house was packed up in boxes, that I would invite them over as soon as we got settled. They were lies. I knew they were lies. But I told them anyway because the truth was too hard. She looked at Grace, at the mother who had kept her alive through those impossible years. My mom never lied to me. She told me we were going through hard times. She told me it was not forever. She told me that what we had, which was each other, was more important than what we did not have, which was everything else. She was right. Sophie unfolded the letter she had been carrying. The paper was worn now, soft from years of handling, creased from being read over and over. Uncle Walter wrote me this letter before I was born, before he even knew there would be a me. But somehow he knew exactly who I would be, exactly what I would need to hear. She read aloud. Sophie Yuqui, I have never met you, but I know you are brave. I know because you have a brave mother, and bravery passes down from generation to generation like eye color or the shape of a smile. One day you will grow up and wonder why life is so hard, why some people take and never give anything back, why the people who should love you sometimes hurt you the most. I do not have answers, but I know one thing. The people who give are rare. The people who keep giving, even when they have nothing left, even when it costs them everything, those people are precious. Lar, your mother is one of those people. Protect her. She has spent her whole life protecting you. And when the world tries to tell you that kindness is weakness, that generosity is foolishness, that only fools keep hoping when hope makes no sense, remember this. Blood does not make family, character does. Be brave, little one. The world needs more brave children. Sophie folded the letter carefully and put it back in her pocket. Uncle Walter died before I could meet him, before I could thank him for saving us, before I could show him what we would become. But I think he knows. I think somewhere, somehow, he is watching us the way he watched my mom for all those years, seeing what we have built, seeing the lives we have changed, seeing that his faith in us was not misplaced. She looked at the monument, at the words carved into the granite. In a world of takers, remain givers. In a time of greed, maintain integrity. Build something that outlasts you. That is what Uncle Walter did. That is what my mom is doing. And when I grow up, that is what I am going to do too. She paused, let her eyes sweep across the crowd. 847 mothers have come through these doors. 847 families who had nowhere else to go. That is not just a number. That is 847 women who learned that someone believed in them. 847 children who got a chance to grow up safe. That is Uncle Walter's legacy. That is what my mom built with the gift he gave us. And it is just the beginning. Sophie stepped back from the podium. The crowd was silent for a moment, then applause erupted. Not the polite clapping of a formal ceremony, but something raw, more real. The sound of people who understood what they had just witnessed. Grace pulled Sophie into her arms, held her tight, felt her daughter's heart beating against her own. I am proud of you, she whispered. So proud. Sophie hugged her back. Do you think Uncle Walter heard? Grace looked at the mountains, at the sky, at the monument that bore his words. I think he heard every word. That evening, after the crowd had dispersed and the caterers had cleaned up and the sun had begun its slow descent behind the peaks, Grace and Sophie and Tom Brennan sat together on the cabin porch. The same porch where Grace had stood 5 years ago. Fresh from the courtroom, trying to believe that safety could last. The same clearing where Sophie had run that first day, discovering what space felt like after 2 years in a car's back seat. The same mountains Walter had watched for 37 years, patient and eternal and impossibly beautiful. Tom had been part of their lives for 4 years now, not as a husband, not as a father, but as something else, a partner, a presence, someone who understood about wounds that never fully healed and showed up anyway. He sat in the chair Walter had built, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, watching the light change on the mountains. Good day, he said quietly. It was. Grace watched her daughter sketching in her notebook, capturing the scene with quick, confident strokes. 5 years of practice. 5 years of drawing the life they had built instead of the life she wished they had. Sophie held up her notebook. 3 figures on a porch, mountains behind them, stars beginning to appear in the evening sky. What do you think? Grace studied the drawing. The proportions were perfect now, the detail precise. But what struck her most was the feeling it captured. Peace, contentment, home. I think Uncle Walter would be proud. Sophie smiled and went back to her drawing, adding details. The quilts draped over the porch railing, the dogs sleeping at their feet, the community center visible in the distance, lights glowing in the gathering dusk. Grace watched her daughter and thought about everything they had survived. The parking lots, the fear, the hunger that gnawed at you when there was not enough food and you had to pretend it did not matter. The courtroom, the lies, the moment when the video played and Walter's voice filled the room, defending them from beyond the grave. The years of building, The foundation taking shape. The women who came through the doors with nothing and left with hope. 847 families. Not thousands, not millions. A number small enough to be real, large enough to matter. Walter had given her the resources, but she had done the work, had made the choices, had turned his careful preparation into something that would outlast them both. Mom, Sophie's voice broke through her thoughts. Are you happy? Grace considered the question, really considered it. She still had nights when the fear came back, when she woke gasping, certain everything had been taken away, certain she was back in the car with nothing but her daughter and her desperation. But those nights were fewer now, and the mornings that followed were easier. The peace that settled over her when the sun rose and she was still here, still safe, still home, felt more permanent with each passing day. Yes, baby, I am happy. Really happy? Like the kind where you are not waiting for something bad to happen? Grace looked at the mountains, at the cabin Walter had built with his own hands, at the foundation that bore his name, at her daughter, 14 years old and braver than Grace had ever been at that age. Really happy. The kind that does not go away. Sophie closed her notebook and leaned against her mother's shoulder, the way she had when she was small, when Grace was all she had, when the world was frightening and uncertain, and the only safety was the warmth of her mother's arms. I am happy too. They sat together as darkness fell and stars emerged. More stars than seemed possible. More stars than Grace had ever seen in the city, scattered across the Montana sky like promises kept. Tom reached over and took Grace's hand. His grip was warm, steady, the grip of someone who had learned to hold on to good things when he found them. The dog lifted his head, ears perked at some sound in the forest, then settled back down with a sigh, satisfied that whatever was out there posed no threat. The cabin waited behind them, solid and permanent, built by a man who had spent 37 years alone in these mountains, preparing a gift for a niece he barely knew, trusting that she would know what to do with it. And she had known, had taken his money and his trust and his faith in her character and built something that would help people for generations, something that honored his memory, something that proved his belief in her had not been misplaced. The foundation would continue after Grace was gone. The tiny homes would shelter mothers and children not yet born. The legal aid program would protect women from the kind of exploitation Grace had suffered. And all of it would trace back to one quiet man in the woods who had looked at the world and decided that kindness was worth protecting. Grace thought about her siblings, about Caroline and Marcus and Diane, scattered now. Their schemes collapsed, their lives diminished by the exposure of who they really were. She did not hate them anymore, did not wish them harm, just felt a vague sadness for people who had never learned the difference between taking and giving, between using others and caring for them, and between the empty victory of getting what you want and the deeper satisfaction of becoming who you should be. They had lost, not just the lawsuit, not just the money, they had lost the chance to be part of something meaningful, the chance to transform Walter's gift into something beautiful, the chance to watch Sophie grow up and help others the way they had been helped. That was the real tragedy, not that they had been stopped, but that they had never understood what they were missing. Walter had understood, had spent decades watching and waiting and preparing, had seen in Grace something worth believing in, and had trusted her to prove him right. She had. Sophie's breathing had slowed. Her eyes were closed, asleep against her mother's shoulder, exhausted from the emotion of the day. Grace did not move, did not want to break the spell, just sat in the gathering darkness with her daughter in her arms, in the mountains before her, in the knowledge that sometimes, rarely, impossibly, good things happen to people who deserve them. Blood does not make family, character does. Walter had written those words decades ago, had believed them with a faith that never wavered, had organized his entire life around the principle that what you did mattered more than who you were born to. Grace believed it too now, had learned it through years of being failed by blood relatives and supported by strangers who became friends, had watched it proven over and over as women came through the foundation's doors with nothing and left with hope. Family was not about genes or surnames or obligated holiday visits. Family was about showing up when it mattered, about giving without keeping score, about loving people not for what they could do for you, but for who they were. Sophie stirred, opened her eyes, looked up at Grace with that old soul gaze that had always seen too much. Mom, yes, baby? I had a dream about Uncle Walter. What kind of dream? He was sitting in the vault, with all his paintings and books around him, and he was smiling. Grace felt her throat tighten. What was he smiling about? Us. Sophie's voice was soft but certain. He was smiling because he could see us, see what we built, see that it was worth it. She closed her eyes again, settled back against Grace's shoulder. He was proud of us, Mom, really proud. Grace looked at the stars, at the mountains, at the monument in the garden below, its granite surface pale in the moonlight. I know, baby, I know he was. The night deepened around them. The stars wheeled slowly overhead. The forest stirred with sounds that had become familiar over 5 years of living in this place. Owls calling, wind in the pines, the distant cry of something wild and free. Grace did not move until Sophie's breathing had deepened into true sleep. Then she lifted her daughter carefully, carried her inside, laid her in the bed that had become hers over 5 years of safety and stability. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching Sophie sleep. This child who had been homeless at 9, who had testified in court with courage that still amazed Grace, who had grown into someone remarkable, someone worthy of the faith Walter had placed in her before she was even born. Then she went back to the porch, sat in the chair Walter had built, watched the moon move across the sky. She thought about the letter he had written her, the one she had found in the vault that first night. The words she had read so many times she knew them by heart. You are stronger than you know, Grace. Stronger than they want you to believe. You have survived things that would have broken most people. You have raised a daughter alone, kept her safe and loved and hopeful despite everything. Do not let them take that from you. Do not let them win. They had not won. They would never win now. The legal battles were over. The restraining orders were permanent. And the foundation Walter's money had built would continue helping people long after Grace herself was gone. That was the victory. Not defeating her siblings, though that had been necessary. Not the money, though that had made everything possible. The victory was building something that would outlast her. Something that would take Walter's 37 years of preparation and multiply it forward through time. Something that would touch lives not yet begun, help people not yet born, prove that one man's faith in one woman's character could ripple outward to change the world. Blood does not make family. Character does. Grace had proven it. Sophie would continue to prove it. And somewhere in the darkness, in whatever came after life, Walter Hartley was finally at peace. The story was not over. Stories like this were never really over. They just continued forward, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of kindness building on another until the original gift was almost lost in the cascade of good it had inspired. But here, tonight, in the cabin Walter built with his own hands, Grace allowed herself to believe it was enough. She had been seen by a man who barely knew her. She had been saved when salvation seemed impossible. She had become someone worthy of the faith placed in her. And tomorrow, when the sun rose over the mountains and a new day began, she would continue the work Walter had started, building something that would outlast her, one family at a time, forever.